Clean my boot, barmaid.
Pay your tab first.
Who are you supposed to be? The man telling you to stop. You just made a bad mistake. No, you did.
A woman on her knees on a saloon floor, not because she was weak, but because a man with money and a gun decided that's where she belonged. That night, a blacksmith stepped out of the shadows, and Oakhaven, Wyoming would never be the same. Hit follow so you don't miss what happens next. The cold came in off the plains like something with a grudge. It didn't just drop the temperature. It pressed against the walls of Oakhaven, Wyoming, worked its fingers into every crack between the boards, and made the lantern flames inside the black kettle. Saloon tremble even when the doors were shut. Outside, the wind dragged loose snow down Main Street in long, pale sheets. The few souls still moving at that hour kept their heads down and their hands buried deep. But inside the saloon, it was loud. Loud in that ugly way that has nothing to do with joy. Maeve Thorne moved between the tables with the practiced ease of a woman who had done this 10,000 times. Carry the tray. Watch the floor. Don't brush anyone's elbow. She wore a dark green wool skirt, patched at the left hem where it had caught on a nail 2 winters ago, and her dark hair was pinned up in the back with a tortoise-shell comb that had belonged to her mother. She wasn't young in the way that made men sentimental. She was 34, and she wore it honestly sharp eyes, a steady hand, a jaw that didn't soften when someone spoke to her roughly. The black kettle was 3/4 full. Drovers and ranch hands mostly, some card players along the far wall, a pair of old-timers nursing the same 2 drinks they'd nursed for the past 2 hours. The piano had given up an hour ago when the player got too drunk to find the right keys. Now the noise was just voices, chairs scraping, glass on wood. Maeve set down 2 whiskeys at a corner table, collected the coins without counting them. She'd count them later after, and turned back toward the bar. That's when she heard it. Not the sound itself. She felt it first. A shift in the room. The drovers at the table nearest the door went quiet. One of the card players folded his hand without looking at his cards. Even the old-timers seemed to compress somehow, like they were trying to take up less space. Jesse Murdoch walked through the front door. He wasn't the biggest man in the room. That was one of the 2 who came in behind him. A slab-shouldered enforcer named Cole, who had once broken a man's jaw over a disputed fence line. The other one, Decker, was leaner, with pale eyes that moved over a room the way a dog's do when it enters unfamiliar territory, calculating, cautious, ready. But Jesse didn't need size. He had the Murdoch name, which in Oakhaven was worth more than size, worth more than decency, worth more than law if you asked Sheriff Bishop, who tended to find reasons to be elsewhere when the Murdoch boys rode in. Jesse was maybe 26, clean-shaven, good-looking in the angular way of men who've never had to work for anything. He wore a long black coat with silver buttons and a hat that cost more than most men in this town made in a month. He scanned the saloon like a man who owned it, which in a sense he felt he did, because his father owned nearly everything else. His eyes found Maeve. She didn't look away. She never did. She had learned a long time ago that looking away just invited them to follow. Jesse crossed the room and dropped into the chair at the big center table, the best table, the one closest to the stove, without asking whether it was taken. It wasn't. Nobody was going to tell him otherwise. Whiskey, he said. Not to Maeve specifically, just into the air, the way you speak when you're certain someone will move to satisfy you. Maeve moved, not because she was afraid, but because this was her job, and her job paid the rent on the room above this saloon where Toby slept right now, tucked under 2 wool blankets, his small hands curled under his chin. She thought about that every time Jesse Murdoch walked through the door. She thought about Toby, and she carried the tray. She brought 3 glasses and the bottle, set it down clean. No spills, no fumbling. Jesse poured his own glass without thanking her, then pushed the bottle toward Cole, who filled the other 2. They drank. She turned to go. "Leave the bottle," Jessie said. She left it. For a while, it seemed like it might stay ordinary. That happened sometimes. Jessie would drink, get loud, make the room uncomfortable, and eventually stagger out. Those were the manageable nights. Maeve had developed a taxonomy of bad nights in her years at the Black Kettle, and those ranked somewhere in the middle. But an hour passed, and the bottle went down, and Jessie got that particular glaze in his eyes, not just drunk, but restless, looking for something, looking for a reason. Maeve was collecting empty glasses from the table beside theirs when it happened. She reached across, and Jesse's arm shot out and knocked the whiskey bottle sideways. Whether he did it on purpose or whether his coordination had simply deserted him, she would never know for certain. What she knew was this. The bottle hit the edge of her tray, tipped, and the remaining whiskey, a good inch and a half, poured directly down the front of her skirt. It soaked through the wool immediately. Cold first, then burning as the alcohol hit her skin underneath. She stepped back, set the tray down on the nearest surface, pressed her lips together. "Well," Jessie said. He was looking at the dark stain spreading across the green fabric, and something in his expression wasn't accidental, clumsy. "I'll need you to settle your tab," Maeve said. Her voice was steady. She had trained it to be steady. "You've been here the better part of 3 hours." Jessie looked up at her slowly. Like the request was so foreign it needed time to process. "My tab?" "Yes." He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Cole and Decker both put their glasses down. The room, which had been carefully ignoring the Murdoch table all evening, went quieter still. "You know whose son I am," Jessie said. "I do," Maeve said. The tab is still owed. It was the wrong thing to say, and she knew it even as she said it. Not wrong because it was untrue. Wrong because a man like Jesse Murdoch didn't hear the words you said. He heard the refusal underneath them. The implication that he was the same as anyone else, that the rules that applied to ordinary men applied to him too. And that was the one thing he could never tolerate. He stood up. He wasn't unsteady on his feet the way she had hoped. The whiskey had made him mean, not sloppy. "You know what I think?" he said. "I think the floor in here is dirty." Maeve said nothing. "I've been tracking mud in all night." He looked down at his boots, then back up at her. "Get down and clean it." The room held its breath. "I'm a barmaid," Maeve said quietly. "Not a maid?" Jesse moved faster than she expected. His hand shot out and grabbed a fistful of her hair, just above the back of her neck where the comb sat, and he yanked. The comb hit the floor. Maeve's head went back. She grabbed his wrist instinctively. Not to fight, there was no winning that, but to keep him from tearing something. He shoved her down to her knees on the grimy floorboards. The impact sent a jolt up through her legs that she felt in her back. Nobody at the surrounding tables stood up. Nobody spoke. Faces turned away toward drinks, toward cards, toward whatever small and convenient thing they could pretend to study. Jesse looked down at her with the calm of a man who has never once been told no, and lived to believe that silence meant consent. "There she is," he said softly. He looked over at Cole and Decker, who were watching with the blank expressions of men paid to stand nearby and not interfere. Then he looked back at Maeve. He put one boot forward, the toe of it muddy and crusted, with the kind of grime that comes from riding in wet weather. "Wipe it." Maeve looked at the boot. Then she looked up at him. She didn't move. Jesse's expression shifted. Whatever amusement had been there curdled into something uglier. He grabbed her wrist, the one she still had braced against his hand, and pressed it flat to the floor. Pinned it there with his palm. Not enough to break anything. Enough to make the point that he could. He turned his head toward Cole and Decker, and what he said next came out low and deliberate, like a man dictating an order he'd given before. "Make her unable to walk." He let the words sit in the air for a moment. "She needs to learn that a woman in this town only exists if a man allows her to stand." Cole pushed his chair back, and then from somewhere near the back of the room came a sound. Not a gunshot, not a voice, a hiss. It started quiet and built fast, a high searing scream of sound that split the air like a whip crack. And it came from the direction of the back door. Every head in the room turned. The whole saloon pivoted on that sound, because it was the kind of sound that bypassed reason and went straight to something older, something animal, that made the body go rigid before the mind caught up. Standing just inside the back doorway, half lit by the lantern above the door, was a man holding a pair of long iron tongs. He was not tall, exactly, but he was built the way working men are built, through the shoulders, through the forearms, through the particular solidity that comes from years of repetitive heavy labor. He wore a canvas work apron over a heavy flannel shirt, and his face was weathered to the color of old saddle leather. His hair was mostly gray. He had the kind of eyes that don't blink more than they have to. In the tongs, he held a chunk of forge iron the size of a man's fist, pulled from the blacksmith fire across the street. It was still glowing at the edges. Not red anymore, moving toward orange-white. Hot enough that the air around it shimmered. He crossed to the nearest table in 4 unhurried steps and dropped it. Not at anyone. Into the water bucket that sat by the table leg. There, in case someone knocked over a lantern. The iron hit the water, and the world disappeared. The hiss that came out of that bucket was enormous, a wall of sound and steam that swallowed everything: the piano, the voices, the creak of the floorboards. A dense, white cloud bloomed up toward the low ceiling. The smell of iron and hot mineral water rolled through the room like weather. Every man in the saloon flinched back from it, faces turned away, hands raised. When the steam began to thin, about 3 seconds later, the room was completely silent. Jesse's grip on Maeve's wrist had gone slack. He was staring at the man with the tongs. Cole and Decker were staring too. The man set the tongs down against the bar with a quiet clank and straightened up. He looked at Jesse with no particular expression. Not anger, not fear. Something much colder and more patient than either of those. "Evening," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. The voice of a man who had learned somewhere in his life that volume is not the same as authority. Jesse recovered faster than the other two. "Who the hell are you?" "Name's Mercer," the man said. "I work the forge across the street." A pause. "I'm also the man who's asking you to let go of her wrist." Jesse laughed. It was the laugh of disbelief. The sound a man makes when the world does something he hasn't pre-approved. "Mercer." He said the name like he was tasting it for flaws. "You have any idea what family I belong to?" "I do," Mercer said. "Then you know what happens to men who put themselves in my business." "I've got a pretty good idea," Mercer said. "Let go of her wrist." Jesse glanced at Cole. The look was brief, a flicker, but it was a signal. Cole went for his holster. What happened next was fast enough that several of the witnesses would later struggle to describe it in sequence. Mercer's hand moved. That much everyone agreed on. His hand moved, and there was a crack, not quite the full report of a fired gun, but close enough to stop the heart, and Cole's shooting hand snapped back, and he made a sound that didn't belong in a human throat. His revolver hit the floor and skittered under a chair. Decker was half a second behind Cole, and half a second was enough for Mercer to shift the barrel and fire again. Decker's gun dropped. He grabbed his wrist with his other hand, face white. Jesse's hand had moved toward his own iron, but Mercer was already there, not pointing. Exactly. Just present, the muzzle of his revolver level, and still at a distance that didn't allow for mistakes. 3 seconds. That was what it had taken. Jesse's hand came away from his holster slowly. He held both palms out. His face had gone through several things in rapid succession and had settled on something that looked like fury, but had fear underneath it, the way ice sometimes forms over dark water. Mercer reached forward with his free hand and lifted Jesse's revolver from its holster. He set it on the bar behind him without looking away from Jesse's face. Then something changed in Mercer's expression. He looked down at Maeve, still on the floor, hair loose around her shoulders, the front of her skirt soaked through. She was not crying. She had her jaw set and her eyes steady, watching him with the kind of wariness that a person develops when they've been in too many situations where the second man to appear was not actually better than the first. Mercer looked away from her, just briefly. He scanned the floor near her feet. He crouched down, and he picked up the tortoiseshell comb. Then he looked across the room. Maeve's shawl had been knocked from the bar stool, where she'd left it at the start of her shift. It lay in a heap near the foot of the bar. He crossed to it, picked it up, and came back. He held it out to her. She looked at him for a moment. Then she took it, and he helped her to her feet, not grabbing, just offering his forearm as something to push against, letting her decide whether to use it, and when she was standing, he draped the shawl carefully around her shoulders and stepped back. He turned to face the room. Every eye in the saloon was on him. The drovers, the card players, the old-timers, the bartender with his hands flat on the bar top, all of them watching. Mercer spoke at a volume that carried easily through the stillness. "A human being," he said, "is born to stand upright and free, not to kneel beneath another man's boots. Just because he carries iron and gold." He let it sit there. Not preaching, stating, the same way you'd state the temperature outside, or how far it was to the next town. Nobody argued with it. Nobody in that room, in that moment, had anything to say at all. Jesse's face was a mask now. Whatever he was feeling, he had buried it. He straightened his coat with both hands. A small, precise movement, the gesture of a man trying to reassemble his dignity with whatever pieces he could find. "You're a dead man, Mercer," he said quietly. "Probably," Mercer said. He didn't sound particularly bothered by the idea. Jesse looked at Cole and Decker, both of them cradling their wrists, and he jerked his chin toward the door. They moved, and he followed, and the three of them went out into the Wyoming winter without another word. The door swung shut. For a long moment, the saloon didn't move. Then, slowly, the room exhaled. Someone set a glass down. Someone coughed. One of the card players picked his hand back up off the table and studied it like he'd never seen it before. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Lou, who had seen the inside of more bad nights than he could count, let out a long breath through his nose and reached under the bar for a rag. Maeve stood where Mercer had left her, the shawl around her shoulders. She was looking at his gun hand. It took her a moment to identify what she was seeing. His right hand. The hand that had moved so fast 3 minutes ago. The hand that had drawn and fired. With that terrible precision, it was trembling. Not a small tremor. Not the kind that comes from cold or exertion. It was the deep, uncontrollable shake of something that lived inside the muscles and came out when the body thought it was safe. He became aware of her looking. He moved his hand to his side and closed it into a fist. But she had already seen it. She looked up at his face. He wasn't looking back at her. He was looking at the door through which Jesse Murdoch had left. His expression unreadable, his jaw tight. Whatever was happening behind those eyes, it had nothing to do with tonight. Not entirely. There was something older there. Something that had been carried a long time. Maeve pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. She had learned something in 34 years of living, most of them hard. She had learned that the men who were most dangerous were the men who didn't shake. The ones without tremors, without hesitation, without any sign that the weight of what they carried cost them anything at all, those were the men you couldn't reach. This man shook. That meant he'd felt it once, felt all of it. Felt it enough that his body remembered long after his mind had tried to move on. She picked up her tray from the table where she'd set it. She looked at the stain down the front of her skirt, already going stiff in the cold draft from the gap under the back door, and she set her jaw and decided she'd deal with it tomorrow. "Thank you," she said. Mercer looked at her then. "Just briefly, go check on your boy," he said. She didn't ask how he knew about Toby. Half the town knew about Toby. She just nodded, set the tray back on the bar, and told Lou she'd be back down in 10 minutes. She was on the stairs when she heard it again from outside, through the wall, faint and familiar. The rhythmic ring of a hammer on iron. He'd gone back to the forge, back to the work, whatever time of night it was, in whatever temperature was waiting across the street. Maeve paused on the step with one hand on the railing and listened to it for a moment. Then she went up to check on her son. The forge was still hot when Mercer got back to it. He'd banked the coals before crossing the street habit, not planning, the same way a man checks the latch on a door before he goes to sleep. And they'd held their heat through the whole ugly business at the Black Kettle. He pulled off his coat, hung it on the peg by the door, and stood in front of the coals for a moment with his hands out. Not for warmth exactly, just to feel something ordinary. His right hand was still trembling. He watched it, the way you watch something that belongs to you, but doesn't always listen. The tremor worked through his fingers in small involuntary pulses, and he curled them slowly inward until his fist was closed, and then he opened them again, and it was still there. It always was after something like that. His body had a long memory, and it didn't distinguish between a Wyoming saloon and a Virginia cornfield 20 years back. Loud noise, fast movement. The particular smell of fear in a room, it remembered all of it, and it shook. He flexed his hand twice, pressed it flat against the warm iron of the anvil, and went to find his hammer. Work was the only thing that helped. Not drink. He'd tried that years ago. And it just made the tremors worse and gave the memories better lighting. Not sleep, because sleep had its own problems. Work, the specific demanding rhythm of making something solid out of raw material. It required his whole attention, and his whole attention was the only thing that crowded out the rest. He picked up the hammer. He set it back down. He stood in the orange light of the forge and accepted the fact that he wasn't going to work tonight. Not really. He was too awake in the wrong places, too loud inside his own head, and the hammer would just ring against cold iron and accomplish nothing. He sat down on the stool by the workbench and waited. Outside, the wind pushed at the walls and moved on. It was maybe 20 minutes before he heard footsteps on the gravel outside, not one set, two. And then the door of the saloon opened across the street, and light spilled out briefly before the door closed again. He didn't look up. He already knew it would be Jesse Murdoch, and he already knew tonight wasn't finished. He was right on both counts. The door of the forge came open without a knock. Jesse stood in the doorway with Cole and Decker behind him, both of them with their shooting hands wrapped in bar rags pulled from somewhere. Cole's face was the color of candle tallow. Decker was breathing through his mouth. Neither of them was going to be drawing iron tonight or for some weeks after, and they knew it, and Jesse knew it, and the knowing was sitting badly on all three of them. Mercer stayed on his stool. He didn't reach for his revolver. He just looked at the doorway and waited. Jesse stepped inside. He moved like a man performing composure rather than possessing it. His jaw was set, his chin was up, and there was a nerve jumping in his cheek that he probably didn't know about. "You made a mistake tonight," Jesse said. "I've made a few," Mercer said. "Might have to narrow it down." Jesse's eye twitched. "You humiliated me in front of 30 men. I stopped you from beating a woman," Mercer said. "If that humiliated you, the problem's not what I did." Jesse crossed his arms. He looked around the forge, the tools on their hooks, the cold iron stock stacked by the wall, the unfinished hinge on the workbench, with the expression of a man inventorying what he might eventually take. "You know my father will hear about this by morning." "Good," Mercer said. "Then he'll know what kind of man his boy is." Jesse went very still. There it was, that particular stillness that comes just before a man does something he hasn't fully thought through. Mercer had seen it many times. He kept his hands loose at his sides, his breathing even, his eyes on Jesse's hands rather than his face, because the face lies and the hands don't. Jesse's hands stayed where they were. He was calculating, and he was sober enough to calculate correctly. Cole and Decker weren't going to be shooting anyone, and Mercer had already demonstrated what he could do when a room moved against him, and the memory of it was fresh. "You're finished in this valley," Jesse said finally. "I want you to understand that. I understand it. You'll leave or you'll regret staying." "Probably," Mercer said. "You said that already, more or less." Jesse held his gaze for 3 long seconds. Then he turned and walked back out into the night, and Cole and Decker followed him, and the door of the forge swung shut on a drift of frozen air. Mercer sat there in the quiet and breathed. His hand was still shaking. He pressed it between his knees and stared at the coals and let the night settle around him. He did not sleep. By the time the sky behind the eastern hills went from black to the color of a bruise, he had fed the forge back up to temperature and was working through a set of wagon wheel rims someone had left for repairs 3 days ago. The hammer fell in its rhythm. The iron moved. His hand was steadier now, not still. It was never entirely still anymore, but steadier, and the work had its way with the worst of it. He heard the saloon door open at about the time the sky went pale gray. He looked up through the small window, set high in the forge wall, the one that faced the street. Maeve came out carrying a bucket, headed for the pump at the corner. She wore a different skirt, darker than last night's. Her work skirt and her hair was already up. She moved with the economy of someone who had been up for an hour at least. She glanced at the forge. He turned back to the anvil. An hour later, she knocked on the forge door. He set the hammer down and went to it. She was standing on the step with a tin cup in each hand, steam rising from both. Coffee. Real coffee, not the burned rye substitute most places served. From the saloon kitchen, she said. Lou keeps the good stuff locked up, but he lets me in the cabinet. Mercer took the cup. Thank you. She looked past him at the interior of the forge. He stepped back, and she came in out of the cold. She studied the space the way practical people study spaces, checking the layout, noting the tools, understanding how a man lived in a place. She looked at his workbench. The hinge was done now, and he'd moved on to a set of door hinges someone in town had ordered before winter set in. Your hand, she said. He looked down at it. The tremor was there. He'd stopped trying to hide it around her. After last night, she'd already seen it, and pretending otherwise seemed like more effort than it was worth. How long, she asked. 12 years, give or take. She nodded, like that answered more than just the question she'd asked. She wrapped both hands around her own cup and drank. You were in the war, she said. Not a question. Union Army, Scouting Division. He drank his coffee. It was good, your husband, a small pause. He was at Antietam. He came home different. Another pause. Shorter. He's been gone 4 years now. Mercer didn't offer anything to fill the silence after that. Some silences don't need filling. They drank their coffee in the warmth of the forge, and outside the wind pushed snow across the empty street. And Oakhaven began its slow morning process of coming awake. She left the tin cup on his workbench when she was done. At the door, she stopped. Jesse Murdoch will come back, she said. He will. Are you afraid of that? He thought about the honest answer. I'm afraid of plenty of things, he said. That's not the same as running from them. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once and went back across the street. It was 2 evenings later when the real reckoning came. Jesse Murdoch returned to the Black Kettle at dusk with Cole and Decker, their wrists still wrapped, but with 4 additional men Mercer hadn't seen before ranch hands from the Murdoch spread, built for the kind of work that didn't appear in any ledger. They took up the same table, ordered whiskey, made themselves comfortable, with the particular comfort of men who have been told to wait and enjoy it. Mercer was at his own workbench when the boy from the farriers came running over. Mr. Mercer. The boy was maybe 12, red-faced from the cold. Murdoch men are back. 6 of them. Lou sent me. Mercer set down the file he was using. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the unfinished work in front of him. Then he picked up his gun belt from the peg by the window. He didn't wear it during work hours, never had, and buckled it on. He crossed the street. He came through the back door of the Black Kettle, the same way he had 2 nights before, and the room responded the same way, a flinch, a sudden attention, the collective animal awareness of a space, adjusting to something that just changed. Maeve was behind the bar. She met his eyes across the room. She didn't look relieved exactly. She looked like a woman who had been doing math and had just had a number confirmed. Jesse looked over from the center table. Well, Jesse said. The blacksmith. He leaned back in his chair, spreading his arms along the chair back, the picture of a man at ease. But he'd positioned himself with his back to the wall and his men arranged to his left and right, which was not the seating of a man who was actually at ease. I was wondering if you'd come. Here I am, Mercer said. You should know, Jesse said, that I had a very interesting conversation with my father this morning. He is not pleased. Neither am I, Mercer said. So we have that in common. Jesse tilted his head. He was smiling, but the smile didn't match his eyes. The thing is, Jesse said, you made me look small in front of this town. And in my family, that's the kind of thing that has to be answered. He looked around at the room, making sure everyone was paying attention. They were. So I'm going to give you a choice. You can walk out of Oakhaven tonight, leave the forge, leave whatever you've got here, and I'll let that be the end of it. Or, he stopped. Let it sit there. Or, Mercer said. Jesse looked at his men. Then he looked back. Or we settle it, the way men settle things out here. The room went rigid. Every person in the Black Kettle understood exactly what that meant, and the weight of it pressed down on the space between the two men. Mercer looked at Jesse for a long moment. He looked at the four new men, noting their positions, the angle of their chairs, the distance to the bar. He looked at Cole and Decker, both of them still favoring their wrists, both of them watching him, with something that was partway between hatred and an involuntary, reluctant wariness. Then he looked at Maeve. She was standing behind the bar, with both hands flat on the counter. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes were on him, steady and dark, and there was something in them that he recognized, not fear, not pleading, just attention. The full, present, deliberate attention of a person who was taking everything in and had already decided, whatever happened, that she would not look away. He turned back to, I'm not leaving, he said. Jesse nodded slowly, as if this was the answer he'd expected and perhaps wanted. He began to push back from his chair. Mercer's hand moved. It was the same hand that shook. The right one, the one with the tremor, the one that had been rattled through 12 years of bad nights and long silences. It moved with the speed of something that had been done so many thousands of times that it lived below thought, below intention, down in the muscle and bone, where training goes when it's really settled in. The revolver was out and level before any of the four ranch hands had cleared leather, and Jesse was halfway out of his chair, and the room snapped into a stillness so complete that the pop of the wood in the stove sounded like a gunshot. Jesse froze. The four men froze. Cole and Decker sat very still with their arms on the table, not moving anything. Mercer stood with his revolver, pointed at a spot in the middle distance between Jesse and the nearest hired man, which meant he could redirect it at either of them in under a second. And everyone in the room understood this. His hand was not shaking now. This was the other thing, the thing he'd never been able to explain properly, even to himself. When the moment was actually on him, when it was real and immediate, and the world had narrowed down to the space between heartbeats, the tremor went away. His body, apparently, had made some agreement with itself that the shaking was for the quiet times, for the times when it was safe enough to fall apart. Right now, it was not safe enough. So the hand was still. Jesse looked at the gun. He looked at Mercer's face. He sat back down slowly. You're going to run out of luck, Jesse said quietly. Might be, Mercer said. But tonight's not the night. It took 4 more minutes, Mercer, counting them by the ticking of the clock above the bar before Jesse Murdoch and his men stood up and walked out. They did it with all the dignity they could assemble, which wasn't much, and they took the unpaid tab with them, which Mercer noted, and which he suspected Maeve had long since stopped expecting anything different about. When the door closed, the room let go. Mercer holstered his weapon. He stood for a moment, feeling the tremor come back into his right hand as the adrenaline drained off, and he put his thumb and forefinger on the bridge of his nose and pressed and breathed. He heard Maeve come around from behind the bar. He heard her stop about 5 feet from him, and he lowered his hand and straightened up. "You all right?" she asked. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," she said, not unkindly. "But you're standing, so that counts." He looked at her. She was looking at his hand again, the right one, the one that was shaking. She had that look she'd had before, not pity. Something else. The look of someone who has personal experience with damage and can recognize it in another person without flinching and without the need to make it smaller than it is. "Come across the street when you're done tonight," he said. "There's a cut from last time that needs cleaning." There wasn't really a cut. There'd been a scrape, already scabbed over. But she came, and she brought a small tin of something that smelled like pine resin and dried lavender. And she sat across from him at the workbench while Lou closed up the saloon for the night. Toby was with her. The boy had been asleep when all this started, and Maeve had left him with the woman who ran the laundry 2 doors down. But when the laundress's husband came in to say the trouble seemed to be over, she'd collected him and brought him along. He was 8, small for his age, with his mother's dark eyes and hair that needed cutting. He came into the forge and stopped just inside the door, looking at the space with open curiosity, the tools, the iron stock, the glow of the banked coals. Mercer watched him. The boy glanced up and caught Mercer watching, and he didn't look away. He just looked back, straight and calm, the way children sometimes do before they learn to be self-conscious about it. Mercer raised one hand in a small greeting. The boy looked at the hand. Then he looked at Mercer. Then he lifted his own hand in the same gesture, mirroring it exactly. Maeve had the salve open and was already reaching for Mercer's hand. He let her take it. She turned it palm up, examined the scrape, and began to apply the salve with the careful, efficient touch of someone who has dressed wounds before. Her fingertips were warm against his cold skin. She was working on his knuckles when Toby came closer. He moved around the edge of the workbench, studying things without touching them, until he was standing about 2 feet from Mercer's side. He looked at the hand his mother was tending. Then he looked up at Mercer's face with a question somewhere behind his eyes. Mercer had been around people with various kinds of injuries and limitations in his time. He'd had men in his scouting unit who were deaf on one side from artillery fire. He understood, in a practical way, that you spoke clearly and you faced the person and you didn't shout, because shouting didn't help. With Toby, it was different. The boy couldn't hear at all, had never heard, communicated in a language built from gesture and hand shape that Mercer didn't know. But the boy was still asking a question. That was clear. Mercer looked at Maeve. She was watching Toby. "He's asking if you're hurt," she said, without looking up from the salve. Mercer looked at Toby. He shook his head slowly. Toby tilted his head. He clearly didn't entirely believe this. Mercer held up the hand. Maeve wasn't holding the left one and shrugged, and made a small gesture toward the scrape, then waved it off. The way you might say, just a scratch. It's nothing, without using words. Toby studied this communication. He seemed to decide it was acceptable. He nodded with the gravity of a boy who has agreed to be temporarily satisfied. Maeve put the lid back on the tin of salve. She held Mercer's hand for another moment, not treating it anymore, just holding it. The tremor was there between them, moving through her palm. She didn't say anything about it. She just held it until it had slowed some, and then she let go and sat back. Toby had found a small offcut of iron bar sitting on the edge of the workbench, cold, long unused, rough at the ends, and was turning it over in his hands, with the interest of a boy exploring something unfamiliar. Mercer watched him. Then he reached over and picked up a small flat file, and he held it out handle first toward Toby. Toby looked at it. He looked at Mercer. Mercer pointed at the rough end of the iron bar and made a filing motion with 2 fingers. Toby's eyes lit up. He took the file. He pulled his small stool up to the edge of the bench and set the bar down and began to work the end of it with very small, very careful strokes. Maeve watched her son. Her expression did something complicated and private. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not making a thing of it." She meant the deafness, or maybe she meant all of it, the tremor. The chaos of the last 2 nights, the boy with his file, the whole accumulation of things that had happened since he dropped that iron in the bucket. A lot of men make a thing of it. Mercer looked at Toby, working away with solemn concentration at his piece of iron. Doesn't need to be made a thing of, he said. Maeve looked at Mercer's hands where they rested on the workbench. Both of them. The right one still moved in its slow, involuntary way. In the saloon, she said when you spoke. What you said. He waited. About a human being born to stand upright. She paused. You believed it? Yes. Not everyone does. No, he agreed. Not everyone does. She was quiet for a while, watching Toby file his scrap of iron down to something smoother. The forge popped and breathed. Wind moved around the eaves. What did Jesse's men do? She finally asked. The ones whose wrists you broke. Fractured, he said. Not broke. There's a difference. He paused. Shooting hand. It'll heal, but it'll take long enough for this to cool down some, maybe. And if it doesn't cool down? Mercer looked at the forge. Then we deal with whatever comes next, he said. There was nothing comforting about this answer. He didn't dress it up, didn't add anything to soften it. She deserved an honest answer more than a comfortable one. He had made an enemy of Jesse Murdoch, and Jesse Murdoch had the resources to make that consequential. That was just the fact. But she nodded. She accepted it the way she seemed to accept most things fully, without pretending the weight wasn't there. Toby looked up from his work and held up the piece of iron for Mercer to inspect. The end was noticeably smoother. The boy looked very pleased with himself. Mercer looked at it seriously, turned it over, ran his thumb along the edge. Then he nodded once, definitively, with the judgment of a craftsman. Toby grinned. It was a full, unguarded grin, the kind a boy gets when a thing he's made, acknowledged by someone whose opinion he has apparently decided to care about, and it spread across his whole face. Mercer's expression shifted, just slightly. Something moved across it and was gone. Maeve saw it. She let it pass without comment. She gathered up her tin of salve and stood, and she signed something to Toby with 2 quick gestures. He set the file down carefully and put on his coat. The iron bar sitting on the bench, a small possession he'd apparently already decided was his, and that nobody in the room was going to dispute. At the door, Maeve paused. Get some sleep, she said to Mercer. He looked at the banked forge, at the unfished work on the bench, at the gun belt on the peg by the window, which he would not be taking off tonight. I'll try, he said. She almost smiled. Not quite. No, you won't, she said. She took Toby's hand and led him back across the dark street, and Mercer stood in the doorway of the forge and watched them go inside and watched the light come on in the window above the saloon. He stood there for a while in the cold. His right hand shook, and he let it shake, because there was nobody to see it now, and because there was no point fighting the things you can't control when you're alone in the dark, and the night is long, and the wind is running hard off the plains. He went back inside. He sat down at the workbench. He picked up Toby's piece of iron and turned it over in his hands. Then he picked up the file, and in the quiet of the forge with the coals glowing orange behind him, he began to smooth the other end too. Sheriff Hoyt Bishop had a habit of arriving after things were settled. It wasn't entirely cowardice. That's what he told himself anyway. On the mornings when he stood in front of the small mirror above his wash basin and tried to locate something in his reflection worth respecting, he told himself it was strategy. That you didn't wade into a Murdoch situation while it was still hot. That you waited for the room to cool, and then you came in and you managed the aftermath, and that was a legitimate form of law enforcement. He was 29 years old. He had held this badge for 14 months. He had not fired his service revolver at anything other than fence posts and tin cans since the day it was handed to him. He came into the Black Kettle the morning after the second confrontation at about 9 o'clock, when the breakfast crowd had thinned and Lou was sweeping the floor and Maeve was wiping down the bar with a damp cloth. He came in with his hat in his hands and his badge catching the thin winter light from the east window, and he looked like what he was, a young man who had slept badly and was carrying the weight of a conversation he didn't want to have. Maeve saw him come in. She set down her cloth and waited. Bishop put his hat on the bar. He looked at it for a moment. "You know I can't let this go on," he said. "Can't let what go on?" Maeve said. He looked up. "Mercer, what he did. Both nights." Maeve picked up her cloth again. "He stopped 3 men from beating me the first night, and 6 men from doing whatever they had planned the second night. If that's what you're talking about, I'll need you to explain to me what exactly can't go on." Bishop's jaw shifted. "Jesse Murdoch filed a complaint this morning. Jesse Murdoch runs a tab he never pays and put me on my knees on that floor over there," Maeve said. She pointed at the floorboards near the center table without looking at them. "Has Jesse Murdoch filed a complaint about that?" Bishop had the good grace to look away. "I need to talk to Mercer," he said. "Then go talk to him. He's across the street." The sheriff picked up his hat and turned it once in his hands and put it back on his head. He went to the door. He stopped. "Maeve," he said her name carefully. "The Murdoch family has interests in half the businesses in this valley, including—" "I know what they have interests in," she said. "Is there something else?" There wasn't. He went out. Mercer was at the forge when Bishop knocked. He was finishing the door hinges, working the last coat of tempering on the second one, and he didn't stop working when the sheriff came in. He just looked up, noted who it was, and kept the hammer moving. Bishop stood inside the door. He looked at the iron on the anvil. He looked at the tools on the wall. He looked at Mercer's hands, both of them, and Mercer let him look. "You fractured 2 men's wrists," Bishop said. "They were reaching for iron," Mercer said. "I stopped them faster than they could finish. Cole and Decker are Murdoch men. They were also about to put a woman on the floor and hurt her until she couldn't walk." Mercer set the hammer down. He picked up the finished hinge and turned it, checking the joint. "You want to tell me that changes the math on it?" Bishop took his hat off and held it. The man did a lot with his hat. Mercer had noticed that. Holding it, turning it, putting it on, taking it off. It was something to do with his hands, when his hands didn't know what to do. "The Murdoch name is untouchable in this county," Bishop said. It came out quiet. Not proud, not defiant, just factual, the way a man states the weather. Mercer set the hinge down on the workbench. "Then the county has a problem," he said. Bishop said nothing. Mercer looked at him directly. "How old are you?" 29. "How long you had the badge?" 14 months. Mercer leaned against the workbench and crossed his arms. He studied Bishop for a moment, the young face, the careful posture, the way the man held himself like someone who was permanently braced for criticism. "I'm going to tell you something," Mercer said. "You can take it however you like." Bishop waited. "When the badge on your chest bows to the rich and turns a blind eye to an abused mother," Mercer said, "it isn't the law. It's just a shameful piece of tin." The words landed and sat there between them. Bishop's expression went through several things in quick order. Offense first, a quick hot flash of it, and then something else underneath, something that looked like recognition, which was more uncomfortable than the offense had been. He opened his mouth. He closed it. "You think I don't know that," he said finally. "I think you know it fine," Mercer said. "Knowing something and doing something about it are different problems." Bishop looked at the floor. There was a long pause, the kind that accumulates when a man is doing arithmetic on himself and doesn't like the sum. "Jesse will press charges," he said. "On what grounds?" "Assault. Discharging a firearm in a public establishment. He had 6 men in that saloon, and he threatened a woman in front of 30 witnesses 2 nights. Running," Mercer said. "You want to run that argument and see how far it gets?" Bishop put his hat back on. He straightened it with both hands. "I'm telling you to leave town," he said. "Not because I think you're wrong. Because if you stay, the Murdoch family will make sure you end up dead or in a federal cell, and there won't be a thing I can do about it." Mercer looked at him for a long moment. "I appreciate the warning," he said. "I'm staying." Bishop stood there for another few seconds. Then he turned and walked back out into the cold. He stood in the street for a moment, facing nothing in particular, and then he turned left and walked toward his office. He didn't look back. Mercer watched him go through the small window. Then he turned back to the workbench, picked up the second hinge, and got back to work. It was late afternoon before Maeve came over. She knocked, which she hadn't done before. He said to come in, and she pushed the door open and entered, carrying something wrapped in a cloth, turned out to be a plate of cornbread and a jar of cold venison stew, both from the kitchen at the Black Kettle. Lou made too much, she said, setting it on the cleanest corner of the workbench. Tell Lou. I'm grateful, Mercer said. I'll let you tell him yourself. She looked around the shop. Things had been rearranged since last night tools rehung. A new bar of stock iron leaning in the corner. The workbench cleared of everything except the hinges and a folded piece of paper with some measurements on it. The sheriff came to see you. He did. What did he say? He told me to leave. Maeve sat down on the stool by the door. She pressed her hands together in her lap. Are you going to know? She nodded slowly, like this was the answer she'd expected, and she was deciding how she felt about expecting it. Bishop's not a bad man, she said. I've known worse. She stopped. Hasn't found a reason to be a good one yet, Mercer said. Something like that. The light was shifting toward evening, coming in at a low angle through the west-facing window and laying a stripe of gold across the floor. The forge gave off its steady warmth. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at something. Probably a rabbit or a shadow, hard to say. Maeve unwrapped the cloth from the plate and set it in front of him. Eat, she said. He ate. She watched him eat in the unself-conscious way of a woman who has spent years feeding other people and has become entirely practical about it. She didn't look away to be polite. She just watched, and when he was halfway through the cornbread, she reached over and broke a corner off and ate it herself. I've been thinking, she said. About what? About what Jesse said. The first night. She paused. That I exist only if a man allows me to stand. She said it without heat, turning it over like an object, examining it. I've heard that kind of talk my whole life, more or less. Not always in so many words. Sometimes it's just in the way things are arranged. Who gets the loan and who doesn't? Whose tab gets run and whose gets collected? Whose complaint gets written down and whose gets filed somewhere and lost? Mercer was quiet, listening. What you said, she continued, in the saloon about a person being born to stand upright and free. She looked at her hands. It shouldn't have needed saying. No, Mercer agreed. It shouldn't, but it did need saying. She looked up. So thank you for saying it. He held her gaze for a moment. You didn't need me to tell you that. No, she said. But the room did. Outside, a gust of wind hit the side of the forge and moved on. The dog down the street had given up barking. The cornbread was gone. Maeve stood up and shook out the cloth from the plate. I should get back. Toby gets restless around dinner time if I'm not there. She was at the door when Mercer spoke. You're cut, he said, on your forehead. From when he pulled your hair. She touched her hairline almost involuntarily. She'd cleaned it herself the night before, the small split at the edge of her scalp where the pins had been yanked out. It's fine, she said. You need to let it breathe, he said. Don't wear the hairpins close to it for a day or two. She looked at him. A slight furrow came and went between her brows. Are you giving me medical advice? She asked. Field medicine, he said. I was a scout for 11 years. You pick things up, she let out a small breath. Not quite a laugh. Something adjacent to one. All right, she said. Dr. Mercer. Just Mercer. She went out. He sat at the workbench for a while after that, not working, just sitting in the cooling light, with his hands folded in front of him. The tremor was quiet tonight. Sometimes it went quiet when he was warm and had eaten and was reasonably still inside his own head. He thought about Bishop. He thought about a man who knows the right thing and can't find the path to it. He'd known men like that in the army, good soldiers who followed bad orders because the structure that held them up required it. Sometimes those men found a moment, a single pivot point, where the structure cracked enough for them to choose. Sometimes they didn't. He wondered which kind Bishop was. The next morning, Maeve brought him coffee again. This time she came earlier, before the saloon kitchen had properly opened, and the coffee was made on the small stove in the room above the saloon where she and Toby lived. She brought Toby with her. The boy came into the forge with his coat on and his boots laced and his iron bar from 2 nights ago tucked under his arm like something important. He set it on the workbench immediately upon entering and looked at Mercer with an expression of readiness. He had apparently decided that the forge was now a place he attended. Mercer looked at the bar. The end he'd smoothed in the small hours was noticeably cleaner than the other end. He pointed at the rough end. Then he held up the flat file. Toby sat down on his stool and got to work. Maeve stood by the forge with her coffee and watched her son. Her expression was the complicated, private one again, the one that had something grateful in it and something that ached underneath. "He likes it here," she said. "I noticed. He doesn't take to places easily." She paused. "Or people." Mercer looked at the boy, who was filing with intense concentration, his tongue just barely visible at the corner of his mouth. "He's welcome," Mercer said. Maeve wrapped both hands around her cup. She was quiet for a while, and Mercer let her be quiet. "I want to ask you something," she said finally. "All right. Will you let me teach you some signs?" She didn't look at him when she said it. She looked at Toby. "Basic ones. So you can talk to him a little without having to go through me." Mercer looked at the boy. Toby had glanced up at the word teach. He must have been watching his mother's lips some, and now he was looking at Mercer with that straight, waiting gaze. "Yes," Mercer said. Maeve looked up. She seemed faintly surprised, like she'd expected more hesitation. "Just like that?" she said. "It's a language," Mercer said. "I don't know it." "He does. Makes sense to learn." She looked at him for a moment. Then she set her coffee down and stood up straight and held up her right hand. "This is hello," she said, and she brought her open hand to the side of her forehead and moved it forward and out. Mercer did it. Toby looked up from his iron bar and grinned. They spent an hour at it. Maeve taught, patient and clear, and Mercer learned, not fast, not gracefully, his large calloused hands struggling with the finer distinctions between some of the hand shapes, but stubbornly. He got hello. He got thank you, which required the fingertips to leave the chin and move outward. He got your name, which involved the dominant hand tapping the back of the other, in a particular way. He got good work, which was what he signed to Toby at the end of the hour, when the boy held up the iron bar for the second time, now smooth on both ends. Toby received this sign with complete seriousness, and then gave Mercer a nod that contained more dignity than most men manage at twice his age. They were still in the forge when they heard the horse. Not the sound of a horse walking, or even trotting, the sound of a horse being pushed hard down a frozen street, coming from the south end of town. Mercer was on his feet before the sound resolved into anything he could identify. Maeve had gone still by the stove. A man pulled up outside the forge. One of the farmers from the north end of the valley. Mercer knew him by sight, a lean man named Aldous, who ran a small cattle operation on the edge of the Murdoch leasehold. Mercer opened the forge door. Aldous was breathing hard. His horse was breathing harder. "Mercer," he said. Word from the Murdoch spread. "Thaddeus is coming." "Thaddeus." "Murdoch," Mercer said. "The man himself. He's bringing 20 guns." Aldous looked over his shoulder, toward the south, like he expected to see the dust cloud already. "He's heard about Jesse, about what happened here." Mercer stood in the doorway. 20 guns. That was not a conversation. That was not Jesse's particular brand of wounded pride. Looking for satisfaction. That was a patriarch arriving with an army, and whatever Thaddeus Murdoch intended, it was going to be felt by everyone in Oakhaven, not just the people directly involved. "When?" Mercer said. 2 days, maybe 3. Aldous dug his heels in and rode back the way he came. Mercer stood in the doorway. The wind came off the plains and found the gap between his collar and his jaw. He stood there for a while, letting the information settle. Then he heard Toby make a sound, not a word, but a sharp, quick noise. The kind Maeve had told him the boy made when he was trying to get someone's attention. He turned. Toby was standing by the workbench. He was watching Mercer's face with those direct, steady eyes. He had his iron bar under his arm again. He raised one hand, he brought it to the side of his forehead, open, and moved it forward and out. Hello. Or maybe, given the context, something closer to, I'm here. Mercer looked at him. He raised his own hand and did the same. Maeve was watching this from the other side of the forge. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just watched the two of them, the man and the boy, both uncertain in different languages, both finding their way towards something that didn't have a word in either of them. She picked up the coffee cups, set them in the bucket by the door to be washed later. 2 days, she said. She wasn't asking. About that, Mercer said. She thought about it. She looked at Toby, who had set his iron bar back on the bench, and returned to the file, apparently deciding that the immediate business was settled and the work should continue. What do we do? She said. Tonight? Mercer said. Nothing. Tonight we act ordinary. He paused. And I'm going to take a look at the bottlenecks on Main Street. Maeve looked at him. You're thinking about defending it, she said. The town. I'm thinking about understanding it, he said. Defending is a later conversation. She accepted this. She signed something to Toby, time to go, probably, or something like it. And Toby put down the file and rolled his sleeves back and put on his coat without complaint. He took the iron bar. He paused at the door and looked back at Mercer. He made the thank you sign, fingertips from his chin moving outward. Mercer did it back. Maeve paused in the doorway. The cut on my head, she said. It's actually feeling better. Good, Mercer said. Don't make a thing of it, she said. I won't. She almost smiled. There it was again, that almost. Like a door that opens a quarter of the way and shows you light on the other side without quite letting you in. She went out. Mercer stood alone in the forge for a while. He picked up his coat. He put on his gun belt. He walked out into the frozen street and stood in the cold air and looked the length of Main Street, from the south end, where Thaddeus Murdoch would arrive, to the north end, where the road bent toward the river. He walked it slowly. The saloon on the left, the blacksmith shop on the right, the general store, the livery, the space between the buildings, the angles, the choke points where 20 men on horses would have to compress themselves down to a manageable line. He walked the whole length of it and came back. Sheriff Bishop was standing outside his office at the far end, watching him do this. Their eyes met. Neither of them nodded. Neither of them looked away. Then Mercer turned and went back to the forge. He didn't sleep that night either. But this time, it wasn't the tremors keeping him up. He sat at the workbench with a piece of paper and drew out the street from memory, the distances, the widths, the roof lines. He marked where the barricades would go if it came to that. He marked the high points. Sometime around midnight, he stopped and looked at what he'd drawn. An ordinary street in an ordinary Wyoming town. The people on that street, Maeve and Toby, Lou at the saloon, old Aldous, and the men like him who worked the valley's hard land, none of them had asked for this. They'd just been living, managing their debts and their cold and their long winters. And the Murdoch name had been a fact of life the way weather is a fact of life. Something you worked around. Mercer looked at his right hand. Steady right now, in the quiet. He folded the paper, put it in his coat pocket. He fed the forge, laid out his tools for the morning, and sat back down on his stool with his back against the warm iron wall of the forge and his arms crossed. He didn't sleep, but he was at peace with that. Outside, Oak Haven lay quiet under its cold sky, and 2 days away, 20 armed men were riding north. The gate at the back of Maeve's property had been broken since September. It wasn't a dramatic break. No storm, no runaway horse, nothing with a story to it. The bottom hinge had simply given way one morning when she pulled the gate open to hang laundry, and the whole thing had dropped and dragged in the frozen mud ever since. She'd propped it back up with a piece of firewood and worked around it. There were 100 things in her life that needed fixing and a finite amount of time and money, and the gate was manageable if you knew to lift it slightly before you pushed. Toby knew. She knew. Nobody else used that gate. So when she came down on the second morning, after Aldous brought his warning, 2 days before Thaddeus Murdoch was expected to arrive, and looked out the small back window above the kitchen basin, she stopped. The gate was upright, not propped. Properly upright, hinges flush against the post, the latch sitting level. Someone had mortised in a new hinge plate, the iron still dark with forge oil, and rehung the whole gate on straight. She stood at the window for a long moment. Then she put on her coat and went out. The work was clean. She swung the gate once, open and shut. It moved smoothly, no drag, no complaint. The new hinge plate was slightly larger than the original, cut to account for the weathered wood, and whoever had done it had taken the time to drive the screws at the right angle so they'd hold through the winter's freeze and thaw cycles. This wasn't someone doing a quick repair. This was someone who understood wood and iron and the specific abuse that Wyoming winters inflict on both. She looked across the alley toward the forge. The hammer was already going. She could hear it, steady and rhythmic. The sound she'd gotten used to in a remarkably short time, the way you get used to. A sound that means something safe is still there. She went back inside. Toby was at the small table, with his schoolwork. The teacher, at the one-room schoolhouse on the north end of the town, had been good about sending lessons home in a way that Toby could work through on his own diagrams and written instructions that didn't require hearing. He was bent over a page of arithmetic, pencil moving in small, careful strokes. Maeve put a hand briefly on top of his head as she passed. He didn't look up. He swatted her hand away in the mild, absent way of a boy who is concentrating and finds affection mildly inconvenient. She went to the stove and put water on. She thought about the gate. She thought about what it meant when a person did something useful for you, without asking, without announcing it, without leaving any marker on it, except the work itself. She had been married once, and before that she had watched her father move through the world, and she had lived long enough to understand the difference between men who helped because they wanted something in return, and men who helped because they couldn't see a thing broken without wanting to fix it. The water came to a boil. She made coffee. She poured 2 cups. Toby looked up when she put on her coat again. She made a quick sign back soon, and he went back to his arithmetic. She crossed the street. Mercer was at the anvil working on something. She didn't immediately recognize a long flat bar of iron, bent at one end, heated to a low red. He was using the Hardy hole and a set punches to work a row of holes through it. He looked up when she came in, noted the 2 cups, and set down the punch. "The gate," she said. She held out his cup. He took it. "Needed doing." "You could have asked." "You were busy," he said. "And it wasn't a complicated job." She looked at him. He drank his coffee with the same expression he used for most things: level, unhurried, giving nothing away that he hadn't decided to give. "When did you do it?" she asked. "Last night, around midnight. Forge was cooling, and the iron." She thought about that. Midnight, in the cold, in the alley, behind her building, rehanging a gate by lantern light, because the forge was cooling, and he had the iron, and it needed doing. Not to impress her, just because. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it." She looked at the bar he'd been working. "What's that?" "Door bolt. For your back door." He set the coffee down and picked it up, showing her the shape of it, the flat bar, the bent end, the row of punches that would eventually become the mounting holes. "Your back door lock is stripped. The bolt doesn't catch properly. Someone could push it open from outside with one hand." She knew this. She'd known it for months, the same way she'd known about the gate. "You noticed that," she said. "I notice things," he said. It's what scouts do." She watched him set it back on the anvil. He picked up the punch again, positioned it, and drove it through with 2 clean strikes of the hammer. Moved it, drove it again. The motion was practiced. Efficient, no wasted movement. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He looked up. "Your hands." She didn't look away when she said it.
Does it hurt?
He considered this with apparent seriousness, which she appreciated. He wasn't going to give her a quick no and move past it. "Not the tremor itself," he said. "The muscles ache sometimes, deep in. Cold makes it worse." He set the punch down and looked at his right hand, turning it palm up for a moment, studying it like a map. "It started after the war. Not right away. Came on gradual about a year after I mustered out. Did you see a doctor?" "Two of them. One said it was nerves. One said it was the blood and told me to stop drinking spirits." A pause. "I stopped drinking spirits." "Did it help?" "Some." She looked at the hand. He was still holding it palm up, and the tremor was there, small and steady, that involuntary movement that she had noticed immediately, and that she suspected most people had been too polite or too uncomfortable to look at directly. "There's something I can try," she said, "if you're willing." He waited. She set her coffee down on the workbench and reached into her coat pocket. She'd brought the tin of salve from 2 nights before, but she also had a small cloth pouch that she set on the workbench beside it. She opened the pouch and laid out what was inside dried lavender, which she'd had since summer, a small twist of dried arnica flower, and a piece of beeswax the size of her thumbnail traded from a woman who kept hives on the east edge of town. "My mother used to make a compound," she said, "for my father's hands. He worked a mill for 30 years, and his hands were a mess. It doesn't cure anything, but it helps with the deep ache." She paused. "The lavender is for the muscles. The arnica is for the swelling. The beeswax holds it together." Mercer looked at the contents of the pouch. "You brought that over this morning," he said. "I brought coffee," she said. "The rest I had in my coat." He held out his right hand. She worked the salve, first warming it between her palms before applying it, the way her mother had done, so it didn't shock the skin with cold. Then she worked in the dried compound, pressing it into the meat of his palm and along the tendons in the back of his hand, using her thumbs to move in slow, deliberate circles the way she'd been shown. He didn't say anything. He sat very still on his stool, his arm resting on the workbench, and let her work. She focused on the base of his thumb first, where the muscle was tightest. Then, across the knuckles, which were thickened from years of work and scarred in the small ways that come from decades of contact with iron and fire. Then, down along the inside of his wrist, where the tendons ran like cable under the skin. The tremor didn't stop. She hadn't expected it to. But after a few minutes, she could feel the deep tension in the muscles begin to release. A slight softening under her hands. "Better," she said. "Yes," he said. Simple and direct, which she had come to understand was how he operated. She kept working. Neither of them spoke for a while. The forge breathed behind them. Outside, the wind moved down the street in a long gust and subsided. "I was thinking," Mercer said. "About what?" "About what you said yesterday. About things being arranged a certain way. Who gets the loan and who doesn't." He was looking at the far wall, at the tools hanging there. "You're right, that it shouldn't need saying. But the reason it does need saying is that most people in a room like that saloon have heard the other version so many times they've stopped questioning it." He paused. "You change that by saying the true thing out loud, in front of everyone. You make it so they can't unknow it." She pressed her thumbs along the inside of his wrist and felt him exhale slowly. "You think it worked?" she asked. "In the saloon. I think 3 or 4 people in that room went home and thought differently about something than they had before," he said. "That's how it works. It doesn't change a whole room at once. It changes one person at a time, and the next time something happens, that person is different, and they make a different choice." He paused. "Slowly, if you're lucky." She finished with the right hand and moved to the left. He didn't protest or pull away, just shifted his arm on the workbench obligingly. She started at the base of his thumb again. "Your husband? Was he a good man?" She thought about how to answer that. "He was a damaged man," she said, finally. He came back from the war and the damage ran deep. He drank. He made bad debts. She worked along his knuckles. He loved Toby. That I can say without qualification. He didn't know how to talk to him. A lot of people don't, but he loved him. She paused. He died of a fever, not heroically, just sick, in the winter, and then gone. I'm sorry, Mercer said. It was complicated, she said. Grief usually is. He looked at her then, and she looked back, and they were close enough that she could see the specific gray of his eyes, which she hadn't had the occasion to notice directly before. They were dark gray, the color of iron in shade, and they had lines at the corners from years of squinting into wind and sun. She finished with his left hand and sat back. This salve will last about 4 hours, she said. You can reapply it tonight if the ache is bad. I'll do that. He flexed both hands slowly, testing the difference. She began gathering the materials back into the cloth pouch. She worked neatly, the same way she did everything, no wasted motion, no fuss. I want to teach you more signs, she said. If you have time today. I have time this afternoon, he said. Once I finish the bolt. Toby will want to be there, she said. Good, Mercer said. He's a better teacher than you are. She stopped. She looked at him. His expression was perfectly serious. But there was something behind it, somewhere back in the gray eyes, that was not entirely serious. She picked up her coffee cup. He's 8. He's patient, Mercer said. You're not. She looked at him for another moment. I'm very patient, she said. You were sighing every time I got the wrist wrong, he said. I wasn't sighing. 3 times I was breathing, she said. It's cold in here. He drank his coffee. She took her coffee and went back across the street. They met in the forge that afternoon, all 3 of them, Mercer, Maeve, and Toby, who arrived carrying his iron bar and immediately set it on the workbench and climbed on his stool, establishing territory. Maeve stood between them and taught. She started with the things Toby used most, the everyday language of their life together. Names. Hungry. Tired. Now, later wait. She taught each sign with her hands first. Then Toby demonstrated, and then Mercer attempted it, and then Toby corrected him, which the boy did with the merciless precision of someone who had been using these signs since before he could walk and had no patience for imprecision. Mercer had large hands. Some of the finer distinctions, the difference between the sign for please and the sign for sorry, which involved similar movements at the chest, took him 3 or 4 attempts before Toby would accept them. He didn't rush, didn't get frustrated, just tried again each time with the same steady focus he brought to working iron. Toby would watch the attempt. He would look at his mother. Maeve would give a small shake of her head or a small nod, and Toby would either sign again for Mercer to copy or move on. After the first hour, something changed. Toby stopped looking at his mother for confirmation. He started responding directly to Mercer, watching the attempt, making his judgment, signing the correction himself. He would take Mercer's large hand in both of his small ones and physically reshape the fingers when the words weren't working, which made Maeve go very still against the wall where she was leaning. She had not seen Toby do that with anyone outside their household. She watched her son, this self-possessed, careful, deliberate boy, reach up and patiently rearrange the fingers of a man 3 times his size. And she watched Mercer hold absolutely still while he did it, not pulling away, not making it awkward, just letting the correction happen with the same uncomplicated acceptance he'd shown everything else. Toby let go. He looked at the result. He nodded once, the authoritative nod. Mercer signed the word correctly. Toby gave him the full grin, the wide, unguarded one that she saw at home, but almost never in public, and signed good in the emphatic way that means very good, something above ordinary approval. Mercer signed, "Thank you back." Maeve looked at the forge wall behind them. She had spent 4 years being the only person in Toby's daily world who signed. His teacher at school tried, with the limited vocabulary she'd been able to learn from a manual. Maeve had gotten through the mail from a school back east. The laundress down the street knew maybe 10 signs. Everyone else in Oakhaven communicated with Toby through his mother, or through written notes, or not at all. In 2 days, Mercer had learned enough to hold a basic exchange. In one afternoon, he had earned her son's correction. Maeve pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling briefly, and then looked back at the room. Good, she said, to no one in particular. Around 4 in the afternoon, Toby began to flag. He was still on his stool, but he'd been working the iron bar with his file for the last 20 minutes, in a way that suggested his concentration was elsewhere. Maeve signed at him he was tired. She could read it in the set of his shoulders. He denied it, emphatically. She pointed at the bar, which he'd filed so enthusiastically that one end of it was noticeably thinner than the other. He looked at it. He seemed to realize the evidence was not in his favor. Maeve signed at Mercer. We should go soon. Mercer looked at Toby. He picked up the iron bar, turned it over, examined it. He looked at the thin end. Then he looked at Toby, and he signed the word for tomorrow with a question. Toby perked up. He signed back. Yes, tomorrow. Mercer set the bar back on the workbench in the spot Toby had claimed for it. Toby climbed off his stool and put on his coat, reassured. They were heading for the door when Mercer spoke. Before you go, he said. Maeve turned. He had his coat on now, and he went to the door of the forge and held it open. Come outside a minute. She exchanged a glance with Toby, who shrugged with the philosophical calm of a boy who has grown up in a world that is often conducting business he's not fully included in. They went out. The cold hit immediately. The late afternoon kind, with the sun already dropping behind the western hills and the temperature falling fast. Mercer walked to the front of the forge and stopped. He looked down Main Street. Maeve stood beside him. Toby stood on her other side. The street was quiet at this hour. The general store was closed. 2 horses were hitched outside the saloon. Smoke rose from chimneys in straight columns, which meant no wind right now. When Thaddeus comes, Mercer said, he'll come from the south. He pointed down the street. 20 men on horses. They'll come down this line, and they'll want to command the center of it. He walked a few steps forward and stopped at a point roughly in front of the general store. He turned and looked back at the forge. Then he looked forward toward the saloon. The bottleneck is here, he said. This is where the street is narrowest. Between the store and the livery. He turned to look at the buildings on both sides. A barricade at this point splits the street. Anyone coming in from the south can't get past it without dismounting. He looked at the roofline of the general store. And anyone up there controls the approach. Maeve looked at the roofline. She looked at the barricade point. She looked at Mercer. You've been planning this since Aldous came, she said. Since before that, he said. Since the first night. She turned this over. He had walked into the black kettle and intervened, and then come back to his forge and started thinking about what would follow, not because he was looking for a fight, because he was a man who had spent years in terrain that could kill you. And he had developed the habit of understanding his ground before he needed to use it. Who's going to help? She said. The town is scared. Some of them are, he said. But scared people have helped build walls before. He looked at the street. The shopkeepers have a stake in this. The farmers have a bigger one. The Murdoch leasehold arrangement has been suffocating this valley for a decade, and most of them know it. Toby had walked a few feet ahead and was looking at the point in the street that Mercer had indicated. He turned back and looked at Mercer, then at his mother. He signed something. Maeve looked at it. She translated. He's asking what goes in the barricade. Mercer looked at Toby. He signed wagons. The sign was approximate, more of a gesture, but Toby understood it, and he pointed at the livery. Toby looked at the livery. He looked at the spot in the road. He nodded, that serious nod. Mercer crouched down so he was at the boy's level. He signed, good thinking. Toby squared his shoulders. They went back inside. Maeve put Toby through the forge door first and paused on the step. I want to be part of the planning, she said. You already are, Mercer said. I mean formally, at the table. She looked at him steadily. This affects me and my son as much as it affects anyone in this town. More, Mercer said. So I want a seat at the table. There is no table yet, he said. But when there is, yes. She looked at him a moment longer, making sure that yes was solid. It seemed to be. Good, she said. She went inside. Mercer remained on the step for a moment, looking down the street. The last of the light was going, the sky turning the dark blue that comes just before full dark, and the temperature was dropping in that fast, final way it does in Wyoming when the sun goes. He thought about Aldis's words. 20 guns. He thought about the tremor in his hand, and what it did and didn't do when the moment was real. He thought about Toby rearranging his fingers with complete patience and authority. He went back inside to the forge and banked the coals for the night. His right hand ached. He put the salve on it, the compound Maeve had left behind in the small tin. Working it in the same way, she had shown him slow circles, starting at the thumb. The smell of it was in the forge now. Pine resin and dried lavender competing with the iron smell. He looked at the bolt he'd finished. He'd hang it tomorrow, on her back door. He'd also check the window latches while he was at it. There were a lot of things that needed doing in the next 2 days. He picked up the paper with the street layout and spread it on the workbench. He picked up the pencil. He started noting positions. The news traveled the way news always does in a small town, not through any official announcement, not through the sheriff's office or a notice on the general store door. It moved person to person, whispered across counters and fences and the gaps between buildings, carried by the kind of low, urgent voice people use when they're frightened and haven't decided what to do about it yet. By the morning after Aldis's warning, everyone in Oakhaven knew. Thaddeus Murdoch was coming with 20 guns. Maeve felt the change in the saloon before she heard anything specific. The breakfast crowd came in quieter than usual. Men who normally argued about cattle prices or the condition of the North Road sat over their food without talking much. Lou kept his head down behind the bar. Even the 2 old-timers who came in every morning at 7 sharp and stayed until 9 were gone by 8, which had never happened before in Maeve's memory. She carried plates and refilled coffee and said good morning to the people who looked like they needed to hear it, and she listened. What she heard, mostly, was fear. By mid-morning, it had taken on a shape. She was washing glasses behind the bar when she heard the word leave for the first time. Not as a question, but as a statement. A conclusion someone had reached and was now sharing. It came from a table near the window. 3 men, all of them farmers who worked the valley's outer edges. She knew all 3 by name. If she wasn't here, one of them was saying, Murdoch wouldn't have a reason to come. Another one, Jessie started it. Jessie started it over her. Maeve set down the glass she was holding. She turned. All 3 of them saw her at the same moment and went quiet in that particular way that means they'd been aware she was there all along. She came around the bar. She pulled out an empty chair at the end of their table, sat down, folded her hands on the table's surface, and looked at each of them in turn. She took her time, doing it. I'll save you the effort, she said. The man nearest her, Harland, who ran sheep on the east side of the valley, shifted in his seat. Now, Maeve, nobody's saying. You were saying it a minute ago, she said. You can say it to my face. I'm not going to break. Harland looked at his hands. The other 2 found things to look at that weren't her. It's not about you personally, the third one finally said. His name was Cutter, and he had a wife and 4 children and a mortgage through the Murdoch land office, which explains some of his arithmetic. It's about what happens to this town if Thaddeus rolls in and there's a fight. There will be a fight, Maeve said, whether I'm here or not. Because this has never been about me. This is about Jesse Murdoch walking into a saloon and deciding that a woman's body is something he has rights over, and a man across the street deciding that wasn't going to stand. If I disappear, the thing that happened still happened. The Murdoch name doesn't get smaller because I left. Silence. And my son, she said. Where exactly am I supposed to take my son? Nobody answered that. She looked at each of them again. "I understand you're frightened," she said. It wasn't a rebuke. She meant it plainly because it was plain. "I'm frightened too, but I need you to understand what you're asking. You're asking me to run. And if I run, then the lesson this town teaches to your children, to my son, to every woman who works a job and carries a debt and tries to make a life here, is that when power comes for you, you move out of the way and hope it passes." She paused. "That's not a lesson I'm willing to teach." Harlan rubbed the back of his neck. Cutter looked out the window. The third man, younger than the other two, looked at her with something in his face that was close to shame. He didn't say anything, but he nodded once, barely visible. Maeve stood up. She pushed the chair back in and went back behind the bar and picked up the glass she'd set down. She stood there a moment with the glass in her hand and allowed herself to feel what was underneath the steadiness, the real thing beneath the composed voice and the level eyes. It was their fear, genuine and cold, sitting right below her ribs where she couldn't dislodge it. The image of 20 men on horses, the image of Toby's face. She set the glass down and picked up another one. Across the street, she could hear the forge. Mercer had been up since before dawn. She'd heard the hammer going when she went to the pump at first light. That steady rhythmic ring that she had come to use as a kind of fixed point. If that sound was there, the world was still in some kind of order. She had gone to the forge that morning. Not for coffee this time, but for the planning he'd promised her a seat in. She'd brought paper and a pencil, which had made him look at her for a moment before he moved over on the workbench to give her room. They had talked for an hour. She'd asked questions, and he'd answered them, and she'd written things down, and at certain points she'd made suggestions that he considered with actual seriousness, and in 2 cases incorporated directly into the plan on the paper. The wagon barricade at the street's narrowest point. She had been the one to note that the livery owner, a man named Garrett, who had been running horses in this valley for 20 years and had his own grievances with the Murdoch lease arrangements, had 3 heavy freight wagons sitting unused beside his building. Garrett, she knew, would say yes if asked the right way. The forge's stronghold. Mercer had laid this out: the building's iron walls, the defensible angles, the heat source for the winter cold, and she had added the detail that the saloon kitchen had a substantial dry goods storage that could sustain a group of people for 2 days, if it came to that. Lou would agree to that, too. Lou had his own reasons. She had written it all down in the clear, efficient handwriting she'd taught herself over the years. And when she left the forge, she took the notes with her because they would be needed when they talked to people. She went to Garrett first. She found him in the livery, repairing a bridle with the methodical patience of a man who has spent his life working with his hands. She pulled up a stool and sat across from him and laid the paper on the workbench between them and explained what she and Mercer were thinking. Garrett listened without interrupting. He was a big man, weathered and quiet, with the kind of patience that comes from managing animals that can't be rushed. He looked at the notes, he turned the paper, and looked at it from another angle. 3 wagons, he said, if you're willing. He was quiet for a moment. The Murdoch Land Office has been trying to buy me out for 2 years, he said. I've said no twice. Third time, they sent Jesse. He folded the paper along its crease and handed it back. Where do you want them? She told him. He nodded. She went from Garrett to the general store, where the owner was a nervous man named Pell, who had a Murdoch loan outstanding on his property. Pell was harder. He stood behind his counter and turned a can of peaches over and over in his hands and said he didn't want trouble. The trouble is coming regardless, Maeve said. The only question is whether you're in a position to have some say in what happens. Pell put the peaches down. He looked at her. He looked out his front window at the empty street. What do you need from me? He said. She told him. The storeroom, which backed against the building, Mercer had identified as a key position. Access to the roof hatch, which was reachable from inside. Some rope, which Pell kept in stock. Pell was quiet for a long time. "All right," he said. It went like that through the morning. Some people said yes immediately. Some took convincing. A few said no, and she noted them without judgment and moved on. By noon, she had commitments from Garrett. Pell, the woman who ran the laundry, a capable, angular woman named Mrs. Fisk, who had been in Oakhaven longer than anyone, and had her own long memory, and 4 of the Valley farmers, including the young one from the saloon that morning, who had nodded at her, who turned out to be named Dawes, and who, when she arrived at his door, already had his coat on. "Figured you'd come around," he said. "Did you? You're not the leaving type," he said. She went back to Mercer with her list, and he went through it and made notes on his paper. And by early afternoon, he was out talking to the men himself, not making speeches, just walking the positions with each person and explaining what he needed from them and what they'd be doing and why it would work. She noticed that he talked to people the same way he talked to her, directly, without softening, but also without condescension. He didn't perform confidence at them. He just laid out the situation as he understood it and gave people enough information to make a real decision. Most of them appreciated that. Frightened people, she had learned, don't actually want to be told everything will be fine. They want to be told the truth with enough clarity that they can figure out where they stand in it. It was late afternoon when the second wave hit. She was in the saloon helping Lou move supplies to the back storage when she heard raised voices outside. She went to the window. A group had gathered on the street, maybe 15 people, which in Oakhaven constituted a crowd. Several of the farmers she'd spoken to that morning, the ones who had said no. Also, a few of the drovers who worked the ranches on the valley's edges, men whose employment was tied more or less directly to the Murdoch operation. And in the middle of them, speaking with the careful authority of a man who has concluded he is being reasonable, was Harland. Maeve went outside. She stood on the saloon's front step and listened. Harland was making the case that Mercer should leave, that if Mercer left, Thaddeus would have no reason to come in force, that the damage had been done to Jesse's men, but it wasn't irreparable, and a man like Thaddeus, who was ultimately a businessman, would take the off-ramp if it was presented to him clearly enough. There were murmurs of agreement from several people in the crowd. Maeve came down the step. She didn't push through the group. She just moved to a position where she could be seen, and the crowd opened for her because crowds generally open for people who move with a certain kind of purpose. She looked at Harland. "You're asking him to run," she said. "I'm asking him to be practical," Harland said. "This isn't his town. He made it his business when he stopped 3 men from hurting me," she said. "And you made it yours when you chose to live here. Oakhaven is your town, Harland. These streets are your streets. That livery, that store, that school, those belong to the people who live here, not to a man who rides in with hired guns and decides what the valley is worth." Harland opened his mouth. She kept going. "If we turn tail and run today," she said, and her voice came out steady and clear in the cold air, "we teach our children that cowardice is the only way to survive." She looked at the faces around her, one at a time, without hurrying, "And I will not do that. I will not stand in front of my son and teach him that we move out of the way because someone with more money decided we should." She paused. "Your children are watching too. Every single one of yours." The street was quiet. Somewhere behind her, she heard the forge door. She didn't look back. She knew the sound of it. Mercer came to stand beside her. He didn't speak. He just stood there, slightly to her left, and looked at the crowd. His presence changed something. Not because he said anything he didn't, but because the people in that crowd had now seen what he could do. And his willingness to stand next to her in the open street carried its own message. Harland looked at Mercer. He looked at Maeve. "Thaddeus Murdoch has been in this valley for 30 years, Harland said. But his voice had lost some of its steadiness. "And what has 30 years of his presence given this valley?" Maeve said. "Lease arrangements that bleed your profit. A land office that moves the terms when it suits them. A son who puts women on the floor of a saloon. She looked at Harlan directly. You've been accommodating that for 30 years. How's that working? Harlan said nothing. The young farmer, Dawes, who had been at the edge of the crowd, stepped forward. He didn't say anything either. He just moved from the crowd side to Maeve's side of the street. One of the farmers who had said yes that morning did the same. Then another. Harlan looked at the people who had moved. He looked at the ones still behind him. Something passed through his expression, the arithmetic of a man, recalculating something he'd thought was settled. He put his hat back on. God help us all, he said quietly, and he walked back toward his end of the street. The rest of the crowd dispersed slowly, in ones and twos back to wherever they'd come from. Some of them went to the saloon. Some went home. Dawes stayed, and so did the two farmers who had crossed over. Mercer looked at Maeve. You're a good speaker, he said. I've had practice, she said. When you're raising a deaf child alone in a frontier town and you need things from people, you learn how to be clear. He nodded. He looked down the street, the direction Thaddeus Murdoch would come from. We have one more day, he said. I know. There's more to do. I know that, too. She pulled her coat tighter. What's next? He looked at the buildings on both sides of Main Street. I want to talk to the shopkeepers about the barricade construction. Tonight, after dark, when there's less chance of someone writing word to the Murdoch spread. I'll come, she said. He looked at her. Toby, he said. Mrs. Fisk, she said. She offered. He nodded. Tonight, then, after the saloon closes. She went back inside. The rest of the afternoon moved in that particular way of days before, something inevitable slowly, and too quickly at the same time. She worked her shift, carried trays, kept the coffee going, listened to the temperature of the room, which was lower and tighter than usual. People weren't leaving. That was something. They were staying and eating and talking in low voices, and several of them, Pell from the general store, Garrett. Mrs. Fisk came in at various points and found their way to a corner table with Mercer, where papers were spread out and voices were kept low. Toby came down at supper time, as he always did, and sat at the end of the bar where Lou kept a stool for him. He had his iron bar, which went everywhere with him now. He worked on his schoolwork for a while, then watched the room with the alert, cataloging gaze of a child who is very good at reading what's happening in a space without the benefit of sound. At one point, he caught Mercer's eye across the room. Mercer signed at him. You all right? Toby signed back, yes. Then he looked at the table full of papers and the people around it and signed, Big problem? Mercer held his hands level and rocked them slightly, the sign for so-so, or in this case, something closer to manageable. Toby considered this. He signed okay. Maeve, carrying a tray past, saw the exchange and slowed, watching. Neither of them noticed her. Toby went back to his schoolwork. Mercer went back to the papers. She went on with the tray. After the saloon closed, after Toby was settled at Mrs. Fisk's, and Lou had locked the front door, Maeve went out the back into the cold alley and met Mercer at the forge. He had lanterns, two of them, kept low, and he had the street layout spread out one more time on the workbench. The men who were committed came in quietly, in pairs, Garrett, Pell, Dawes, two others. Mrs. Fisk's husband, who turned out to have done 2 years of military engineering before he settled in Wyoming, and who looked at Mercer's barricade plan and immediately started improving it. They worked at the table for 2 hours. Voices low, the forge warm behind them. The Wyoming night pressing against the walls. Mercer laid out the barricade placement, the rooftop position, the forge as last retreat. Fisk's husband added measurements and load calculations for the wagon arrangement. Dawes said he had a cousin with a rifle who could shoot. Garrett said the freight wagons could be moved before dawn without making significant noise if they greased the wheels first. Maeve sat at the table with her paper and her pencil and wrote it all down, who was responsible for what, the timing, the sequence. When it was done, she looked at what she'd written. It was a plan, real and detailed and possible. She looked around the table at the faces. A liveryman, a storekeeper, two farmers, a man who used to build bridges for the army, and Mercer, sitting at the end with his hands flat on the table, and the tremor there, always there, in the right one. None of them were soldiers. None of them had asked for this. They were here anyway. One more day, Mercer said to the table. One more day, Garrett said. They went out into the cold in ones and twos, and the alley went quiet, and Oakhaven lay under its sky and waited. Mercer stood in the doorway of the forge after the last of them had gone. Maeve stood beside him, her notes folded in her coat pocket, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. "Do you think it'll hold?" she said. "The plan. Plans don't hold," he said. "People do." He looked down the dark street. "These ones will." She looked at the same stretch of dark street. "I hope you're right," she said. "So do I," he said, which was the most honest answer he could have given, and she respected it for exactly that. She pulled her coat tight and went to collect her son. They came at noon. Not dawn, the way Mercer had half expected the predatory early hour that gives an arriving force the advantage of catching a town still slow with sleep. Thaddeus Murdoch didn't operate that way. He came at noon, when the sun was at its flat winter height, and the light was as good as Wyoming offered in January, because Thaddeus Murdoch had been doing things in daylight for 30 years and had never once felt the need to hide. Mercer heard them before he saw them. The sound of 20 horses moving together has a particular quality, not loud exactly, but felt, a low percussion that works through the ground before it reaches the ears. He was at the anvil when it started, and he set the hammer down and stood still for 3 seconds, just listening. And then he took off his apron and hung it on the peg and put on his coat. He was outside before the first rider crested the south end of Main Street. They came in a column, 2 abreast, which meant the line stretched back a considerable distance. Thaddeus was at the front. Mercer recognized him by the way he rode, not the face. He was still too far for that, but the posture. Straight-backed, unhurried, with the ease of a man who has spent so many hours on horseback that the horse has become an extension of his intentions rather than a separate animal requiring management. Behind him, Jesse. Mercer saw Jesse and felt the specific quality of attention that comes from looking at a man you know will cause harm before the day is finished. Jesse rode with his shoulders forward, his hat pulled low, and even from 50 yards there was something wound tight in him, a coiled restlessness that his father's composed bearing only made more visible by contrast. The rest were hired men. Mercer scanned them out of habit, the way a scout scans, noting weapons, noting demeanor, noting who was watching the buildings and who was watching the street, and who was watching nothing in particular, because they were being paid to be present rather than to think. Most of them were being paid to be present. 4 of them, positioned at intervals through the column, were watching the buildings. Those were the ones that mattered. The Essen slowed as it reached the center of Main Street. Not because of the barricade wasn't there yet. Garrett's wagons were pulled back into the alley beside the livery, positioned and greased and ready. Mercer had made the call that morning to hold them. Rolling the wagons out too early would tell Thaddeus exactly what they knew and what they'd planned, and there was value, for now in Thaddeus, not knowing the full shape of what was waiting for him. The column stopped. Thaddeus Murdoch sat his horse in the middle of Main Street and looked at the town. He was older than Mercer had expected, though he didn't know quite why that surprised him. 60, perhaps, or close to it. A heavy man, not fat but solid, in the way of men who have worked physically all their lives and then stopped working physically while continuing to eat as if they hadn't. His face was broad and weathered, with a white beard trimmed close and eyes that were set deep under a heavy brow. He had Jesse's coloring, or rather, Jesse had his, but where Jesse's face moved constantly. Tracking for advantage and reaction, Thaddeus's face was still. He looked at the forge. He looked at Mercer. Mercer stood on the boards in front of the forge and looked back. Behind him, from several points along the street, he was aware of movement doors opening slightly, faces appearing at windows, the quiet positioning of people who had agreed to be in certain places when certain things happened. He didn't look. He trusted the plan, and more than the plan, he trusted the people. Thaddeus swung down from his horse. He was not a man who needed help dismounting, and he didn't ask for any. He landed solidly, handed his reins to the man beside him, and walked forward. He walked the same way he rode, straight-backed, unhurried, with the particular gravity of a man who has never had to move quickly because he's always controlled the timeline. He stopped about 10 feet from Mercer. His hired men had fanned out slightly in the street behind him, a practiced arrangement that happened without any visible signal. Jesse stayed on his horse. He'd moved to the left, just off his father's shoulder line, and he sat there with his gloved hands on the saddle horn and watched. Thaddeus looked at Mercer for a long moment. His eyes were pale, a grayish blue, and they moved over Mercer's face with the methodical attention of a man reading a document. "You're Mercer," he said. His voice was deep and deliberate, not loud. Men who have real authority rarely nighed volume. "I am," Mercer said. "You work the forge here." "I do." Thaddeus clasped his hands behind his back. He tilted his head slightly, still looking. "You hurt 2 of my men." "They were drawing on me," Mercer said. After threatening a woman in front of a room full of witnesses, "My son tells a different story." "Your son," Mercer said evenly, "was there." Thaddeus was quiet for a moment. He was still studying Mercer's face, and the attention had shifted into something more specific, not the general appraisal of a man sizing up a threat, but something more personal, more searching. "Have we met?" Thaddeus said. "No," Mercer said. Thaddeus frowned. "A small thing, just a tightening at the brows." "You look familiar to me." "I've got a common face," Mercer said. "No," Thaddeus said slowly. "No, you don't." He took a step forward. Mercer held his ground. Thaddeus studied him from a foot closer, and the frown deepened. "Where were you in the war?" "A beat, Virginia," Mercer said. "Shenandoah Valley, later, the Peninsula campaign." Thaddeus went very still. "What unit?" he said, and his voice had changed. Something had moved behind his eyes that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. "Scouting Division," Mercer said, "under Colonel Hargrove, attached to the 14th Infantry for most of '63. The stillness in Thaddeus deepened into something that a careful observer might have called shock, though it was the shock of a man who has disciplined himself so thoroughly that even profound surprise comes out controlled. "Daniel," he said. He said it very quietly. "You served with my son, Daniel." It wasn't a question. Mercer was quiet. "You were his commanding officer," Thaddeus said. The pale eyes had gone somewhere else briefly and come back. "I remember the name now. He wrote about you." In his letters home, the street was absolutely silent. Even the horses had settled. Mercer said nothing. Thaddeus's jaw tightened. "You know what happened to him?" "Yes," Mercer said. "Then you know what they said." And there it was, the thing that had been underneath Thaddeus Murdoch's 30 years in this valley, underneath the empire and the hired guns and the strangling lease arrangements. Grief, old and unresolved, with suspicion coiled inside it, like wire in a fence post. They said he was shot in the back during a retreat, and that his commanding officer— "Know what they said," Mercer said. "Then tell me," Thaddeus said, and for one unguarded moment the patriarch's composure cracked just enough to let through something raw, a father's need, enormous and long suppressed. "Tell me what actually happened to my boy." Mercer opened his mouth. The shot came from the left. It was not aimed at Thaddeus. It was not aimed at any of the hired men. It came from Jesse's position, off his father's left shoulder. And it happened fast, the snap of a hammer, the flat crack of the report, and Mercer felt the impact before he heard the second part of the sound, the bullet finding his left shoulder and driving him back and sideways off the boards. He went down into the frozen mud of Main Street. The pain arrived about 2 seconds after the impact, which is how it works, the body registering the damage on a slight delay. the nerves catching up to what the bones and muscle already know. It was significant pain. Not the worst he'd ever felt, but high on the list, a deep, tearing burn in the shoulder joint that told him the bullet was still in there. He lay in the mud and looked up at the flat winter sky. He heard Maeve scream. It was one word, his name, and it cut across the sudden chaos of the street. With a clarity that his brain registered and held on to even through the pain, he heard Jesse's voice above and behind him, already elevated, already performing for the audience of hired men and frozen townspeople. There, that's what you get. That's what comes of putting yourself in Murdoch business. And then Jesse's voice went up another register. The controlled performance cracking into something manic, something that had been under pressure for days and had now been released by the noise and the blood and the fact of the gun in his hand. You hear me? All of you? This is done now. Mercer is done. And anyone else in this town who thinks they can stand up to us. He let the gun make the rest of the argument, firing it once into the air, a percussive exclamation point. I'll burn this whole town to ash. Every building. Every last plank of it. Mercer tried to get up. His left arm didn't cooperate. He got his right hand under him and pushed, and he made it to one knee, and the street tilted badly and then leveled, and he pressed his right hand flat against the mud and breathed through the pain in 3 slow, deliberate passes. He looked up at Jesse. Jesse was still on his horse, the pistol raised, his face bright with the particular exhilaration of a man who has just done something irreversible and is still at the stage where that feels like power rather than consequence. Thaddeus had turned. He was looking at his son. Whatever expression was on Thaddeus Murdoch's face in that moment, it was not pride. It was not satisfaction. It was something harder to name a man seeing something clearly for perhaps the first time after a very long time of choosing not to see it. Maeve reached Mercer's side. She came from the direction of the saloon, moving fast, dropping to her knees in the mud beside him, without any apparent concern for the 20 armed men in the street. She got her hands on his shoulder, one supporting, from below, one pressing against the entry wound through the fabric of his coat, and the pressure was immediate and purposeful. It hurt, he didn't say. Anything, I've got you, she said. Don't try to stand yet. I'm all right, he said. You're not all right, she said. Stop talking. He looked at her face. She was pale but entirely steady, her dark eyes doing that thing they did present, fully present, taking in everything around her, without losing the center of attention, which was him. The plan, he said quietly. The plan is still the plan, she said equally quietly. You just need to not be in the street for it. He heard Jesse above them, still talking, the manic energy running on now without much direction, the words less important than the volume, the performance of dominance for an audience. He heard Thaddeus say something to Jesse in a low voice. Jesse's monologue didn't stop, but it shifted registers slightly. He'd heard his father, and it had introduced something uncertain into the performance without stopping it. From the corner of his eye, Mercer saw Bishop. The sheriff had come out of his office at the far end of the street, which in itself was notable. He was standing on the boards outside his door, not advancing, not retreating, his hand on the frame of the door. His badge caught the flat winter light. He was watching Mercer in the mud, and Maeve beside him, and Jesse on his horse, still waving the pistol, and his face was doing the arithmetic that a man's face does when the thing he's been avoiding has arrived so completely that avoidance is no longer structurally possible. Maeve put her arm under Mercer's right shoulder. Up, she said, slowly. He came up slowly. The street tilted again and leveled again. His left arm hung wrong. He kept his eyes on the horizon, a scout's trick fix on the far distance. It helps the body stay oriented. She had him on his feet and was moving him toward the saloon door when Jesse's voice came after them. That's right, Jesse called. Go tend your broken-down soldier barkeep. He's got nothing more to do here. Mercer stopped. Maeve's grip on his arm tightened. Keep moving, she said quietly. In a moment, he said. He turned around. He looked at Jesse on his horse. He looked at the 20 men in the street. He looked at Thaddeus, who was looking back at him with those pale gray blue eyes. He looked at Jesse one more time. "You shot a man in the back," Mercer said. His voice was steady. "In front of your father and 20 witnesses." He paused. "That's the kind of man you are." Jesse's face went through something. Mercer turned back and let Maeve move him toward the saloon door. Behind them, Jesse said something that the wind took before it arrived. And then Thaddeus's voice, distinct and low. "Jesse, that's enough." I said enough. The door of the black kettle opened from inside Lou, who had been watching through the window and had the presence of mind to have the back room ready. He held the door wide, and Maeve moved Mercer through it, and the door closed behind them on the noise of the street. Inside the saloon, it was warm and dim and quiet in the specific way of an interior space that's been holding its breath. Lou had a table cleared and a lamp lit in the back room. There was already water heating on the kitchen stove, and Doc Hennessy, an old man who had been the only doctor in Oakhaven for 15 years, and who had set bones and removed arrows and stitched up every variety of damage the frontier offered, was coming down the back stairs, pulling on his coat. He'd been sent for before the Murdoch column was even halfway down Main Street. That had been Maeve's doing, the morning's preparation, the thinking it had that didn't show until you needed it. She got Mercer to the cleared table, and he sat on it, and she began working his coat off his shoulders with Hennessy, who was already talking in the calm, rapid, specific way of a man running through a familiar procedure. "Through and through," Hennessy said, looking at the shoulder. "Still in there," Maeve said. "No exit." Hennessy made a sound that expressed professional opinion without words. Mercer sat on the table and breathed in the pattern he'd learned years ago. 4 counts in, hold for 4 counts out, which didn't remove the pain, but gave it something to run against. He could still hear the street outside, indistinct through the walls, but present. Jesse's voice, periodic and elevated. Thaddeus's voice, less frequent and lower. The horses. The particular acoustic quality of a lot of people in a small space making a controlled noise. "You need to lie back," Hennessy said. "Not yet," Mercer said. Hennessy looked at him. "Son, I've got to take that bullet out." "I know," Mercer said. "Give me 1 minute." He looked at Maeve. She was standing at the table beside him, her hands folded together in front of her. There was mud on her skirt from the street, and something as blood. He realized on her right hand that she hadn't wiped off yet. "The wagons," he said. "Garrett knows when to move them," she said. "Bishop." "I saw him," she said. "He's still out there." "He needs a reason," Mercer said. She held his gaze. "Then we'll have to give him one," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he lay back. Hennessy moved in immediately, efficient and without ceremony. He was talking as he worked, not to Mercer particularly, just a running commentary the way some men do, noting what he was seeing, what he was doing, what would need to happen after. Maeve moved to Mercer's right side. She picked up his right hand and held it, not romantically, not tenderly, but in the practical way of someone giving a person in pain something solid to hold on to. His right hand shook against hers. She held it through the shaking without comment. Outside on Main Street, Jesse Murdoch was still talking, still performing, still burning with the manic energy of a man who fired a shot at another man's back and called it justice. And Thaddeus Murdoch was standing in the street listening to his son, and something in those pale gray-blue eyes had begun slowly. The process of becoming something different than it had been an hour ago. Mercer stared at the ceiling of the back room and breathed and counted and felt the doctor work. His left shoulder was on fire. His right hand gripped Maeve's and held on. Through the wall, he could hear Jesse's voice rising and falling, the words unclear, but the shape of them unmistakable, a man who believed that volume and violence were the same as authority, performing that belief for everyone present. Mercer closed his eyes. He thought about a cornfield in Virginia in the autumn of 1863. He thought about a young man with his father's pale eyes, who had stepped into the path of something that was meant for someone else. He thought about a pocket watch, which was in his coat pocket, which Maeve had folded and set on the chair beside the table. He had been carrying it for 13 years. He had been waiting, without fully knowing it, for the right moment and the right person to give it to. That moment, he understood now, was coming. But first he had to get through the next 12 hours. He breathed. He counted. He held on. The bullet came out at 1:30 in the afternoon. Hennessy worked for 40 minutes, his instruments laid out on the cloth Maeve had spread across the side table, his hands moving with the unhurried precision of a man who had done this exact thing more times than he could usefully count. He talked through it the way he always did, not to comfort, just to narrate, a habit from years of working on patients who were conscious and needed something to focus on besides the pain. Mercer lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and breathed. When Hennessy finally set the bullet on the cloth beside his instruments, a small, dense thing, flattened slightly on one side where it had met bone, he made a sound of professional satisfaction and began packing the wound. "Through the muscle," he said. "Missed the joint. You'll have use of the arm in a few weeks, if you don't do anything stupid with it before then." "Define stupid," Mercer said. "Getting shot again," Hennessy said. Maeve was at the window that looked out on the alley. She'd been moving between the window and the table throughout the procedure, watching the street beyond the alley, watching Mercer, watching the door. Not restless. Purposeful. The way a person moves when they have multiple responsibilities and a finite amount of space to manage them in. She turned from the window. "Thaddeus has pulled his men back to the south end of the street. Jesse is still out there." Hennessy began bandaging. "Jesse with the men or separate?" "Separate," Maeve said. "He's got 3 with him. The others are with Thaddeus." Mercer absorbed this. A split in the Murdoch force, even a temporary one, was something. "Thaddeus," he said. "What's he doing?" "Standing," Maeve said. "Just standing there." She paused. "He looks like a man who's thinking." Hennessy tied off the bandage, pulled Mercer's shirt back up over the shoulder, and stepped back. He looked at his patient with the evaluating eye of a man checking his own work. "You need to stay horizontal for the next few hours." The blood loss wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't nothing either. "How long before I can be upright?" "Ideally, tomorrow morning. Realistically." Hennessy picked up his instruments and began cleaning them with the cloth. "4 hours if you eat something and drink the water I'm leaving you. But I want someone in here with you." "I'll be here," Maeve said. Hennessy looked at her, and something passed through his expression, a recognition of the specific quality of her presence in the room. The way she had held Mercer's hand through the procedure, without making it ceremonial, the way she had laid out his instruments without being asked, because she'd watched him work before and knew what he needed. "Yes," he said simply. "I know you will." He gathered his bag. At the door, he paused. "If the fever comes up past 103, you come get me, regardless of what's happening out there." "I will," she said. He went out. The back room was quiet. Outside, through the walls, the street had a particular muffled tension to it, the way a space sounds when people are in it, but keeping still. Mercer turned his head and looked at the ceiling. "Tell me what you need," Maeve said. "Give me 10 minutes, he said. "Then we need to talk about the plan." She sat down on the chair beside the table. She picked up the cloth from the side table, the one she'd spread for Hennessy's instruments, and she folded it with the automatic efficiency of someone who is keeping her hands occupied while her mind is elsewhere. She looked at his coat on the chair, at the shape of the pocket watch through the fabric. She looked away. "Toby," Mercer said. "With Mrs. Fisk," she said. "She knows not to let him out. She'll keep him busy." "Good, he doesn't know what happened," she said. "Yet." A pause. "He'll know something happened." "He's sharp," Mercer said. "Too sharp sometimes," she said. "He reads faces the way other children read words. He'll know from mine the minute he sees me." "Then tell him the truth," Mercer said. "Not all of it, but the true shape of it." She looked at him. "He's 8. 8-year-old children understand. A lot more than we decide to tell them, Mercer said, and they fill the gaps we leave with whatever their imagination gives them, which is usually worse than the truth. She sat with that for a moment. You sound like you know, she said. I had a daughter, he said. She'd be 14 now. The room was very quiet. Maeve looked at his face. He was looking at the ceiling. His expression was the contained closed thing it was when something was being held with great deliberateness rather than great ease. She did not push. She waited. My wife took her east when I mustered out, he said. I was not the man she'd married by then, not in the ways that mattered for a family, he breathed. I get letters sometimes. She's well, they both are. I'm glad, Maeve said. So am I, he said. And he meant it plainly, without bitterness, which was perhaps the most difficult thing about it. She folded the cloth again. Smaller this time. The 10 minutes passed. She gave him a few more without marking them as such, because she knew when a person needed time and when they needed to be moved along, and she had become, without planning it, fairly accurate about reading the difference in him. Then she stood up. All right, she said. The plan? He began to push himself upright. She was beside him immediately, not hovering, just available a hand at his right shoulder, steady and without drama, letting him do the work of sitting up while making sure he didn't go sideways. He made it. He sat on the edge of the table with his feet on the floor and his left arm in the sling Hennessy had fashioned, and his right hand on his knee, and after a moment the room leveled. Garrett, he said. He moved the first wagon into position an hour ago, she said, while Jesse was performing in the street. I signaled him from the window. Mercer looked at her. The Murdoch men were watching Jesse, she said. Nobody was watching the alley behind the livery. How much of the barricade is placed? One wagon. The other two need to go to the north of it. We can't do those until the men in the street have moved or are occupied. He thought about this. One wagon across the street's narrowest point was better than nothing, and considerably better than it had been 3 hours ago. It wouldn't stop 20 horses, but it would slow them, and in a defensive situation, slowing was almost as good as stopping, because it gave the people on the other side time. The roof position, he said. Pell's storeroom. Dawes went up at noon, she said. He's been there since. Does he have a line of sight to the south end? Clear to Thaddeus's position, she said. He said so through the window when I walked past. Mercer looked at her, at the organized, precise accounting of what she had done in the hour and a half he'd been on his back. She had not stopped. She had managed the doctor, managed the window watch, managed the signals to Garrett, managed Toby's safety, and was now delivering a complete operational report from memory, accurately and in order. He had served with men commissioned officers, trained for exactly this, who could not have done what she had just done. The forge, he said. Have the others moved to it? Mrs. Fisk has the women and the children from the east end of the street there. Since 2 o'clock, she said. Lou opened the kitchen stores. There's enough food and water for 48 hours. Who's managing the forge itself? Fisk's husband, she said. He kept it banked, knows how to keep the heat up. Mercer looked at the window. The light had the quality of mid-afternoon, flat and white, beginning its slow shift toward the grayer tones of late afternoon. In January, in Wyoming, full dark came fast once it started. We have maybe 3 hours of useful light, he said. 2.5, she said. He stood up. The room tilted once and steadied. His left shoulder was a sustained, deep burn, managed by the thing that manages pain. When there isn't an alternative, not gone, just quieter than the situation requiring his attention. He took 2 steps. Solid enough. I need to get to the forge, he said. You need to lie back down, she said. Maeve. Gideon? It was the first time she had used his given name. They both registered it. She didn't take it back or qualify it. The people in that forge are there because we asked them to be, he said. They need to know what the plan is and that someone is running it. I can do that sitting down. She looked at him for a long moment, measuring. Through the back, she said. The alley, not the street, agreed, and I go with you. Yes, he said. She helped him with his coat, working the left sleeve carefully over the sling, which required patience and a particular angle. And she took her own coat from the peg and put it on, and she picked up Mercer's gun belt from the chair where she'd set it and held it out. He looked at it. He looked at his left arm. Right hip, he said. I can draw left-handed if I have to. She buckled it on him. Her hands were quick and efficient, and she didn't make it into anything. It wasn't. Just a practical necessity requiring assistance. They went out the back. The alley was cold and gray, running between the backs of the buildings on Main Street. A strip of frozen mud, narrow enough that they walked single file, Maeve slightly ahead, watching the gaps between buildings for movement. The forge's back door was 30 yards from the saloon. They covered it without incident. Inside the forge, it was warm and crowded. Mrs. Fisk had organized the interior with the authority of a woman who has run a household in hard conditions. For decades, children in the far corner, with blankets, adults arranged near the walls. A clear lane kept open to the forge itself and to both doors. There were perhaps 20 people in a space built for one man and his work, and it was loud with the particular suppressed energy of people being brave in close quarters. When Mercer came through the door, the room went quiet. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He was pale, and the sling was visible under his open coat, and the effort of the alley walk was in his face. But he was upright, and his eyes were clear, and those two facts did something important to the atmosphere in the forge. Fisk's husband came forward. You should be down, he said. Shortly, Mercer said. How's the coal? Good for 12 hours, Fisk said. Maybe more. Mercer moved to the workbench where his street layout was still spread. He stood over it and put his right hand flat on the table to steady himself, and he looked at the people in the room. Here's where we are, he said. He told them. Not everything, and not slowly, he gave them the operational picture in the same direct way he'd given Maeve the plan 2 days ago. 1 wagon placed, 2 more to go. Dawes on the roof. Thaddeus separated from Jesse. 2.5 hours of light. He told them what each group needed to do and when and why. Nobody interrupted. Not because they were passive, because they were listening, and there's a difference. When he finished, Mrs. Fisk spoke. What do we do if Jesse fires the buildings? The forge won't burn, Mercer said. Iron walls. He looked at the layout. The buildings adjacent to the forge, the general store side, and the alley side, we've wet the walls and the roof already. I had the women do that this morning, Maeve said from beside him, confirming it to the room. Mrs. Fisk nodded. She was a woman who asked questions to confirm plans, not to express doubt, and the confirmation was enough. One of the farmer's Dawes' cousin, the one with the rifle, raised his hand. Roof position holds even if Jesse moves south. It covers both ends, Mercer said. Stay low until you have a reason not to. The cousin nodded. Mercer looked at the room. These people, the liveryman, the storekeeper, the farmers, the women who had wet the walls that morning in the Wyoming cold, Mrs. Fisk, who had organized 20 frightened people into a functioning shelter, Lou, who had opened his stores without being asked twice, had all chosen to be here. Not because they were soldiers, or because they had no fear. They had fear. It was visible in the tight jaws and the hands that held their own elbows, and the children in the corner, who were very quiet because they understood, without being told that this was a time for quiet. They were here anyway, because they decided something mattered more than the fear. He looked at Maeve beside him. She was looking at the room with the same expression she'd had in the saloon when she'd spoken to Harland, and the crowd present, clear, steady. Not fearless, steady. There's a wider distance between those two things than people generally acknowledge. One more thing, he said to the room. They waited. If this goes the way I believe it will, he said, the deciding factor will not be weapons or position. It'll be whether the people on our side hold their nerve when the moment is uncertain. He paused. Uncertain doesn't mean lost. It just means not resolved yet. You hold your position, and you trust the plan, and you trust each other, and you wait for resolution. Can you do that? A beat of silence. Then Garrett said, From the back of the room, "We're still here, aren't we?" A small, collective exhalation moved through the forge. Not quite laughter. Something adjacent to it that had relief in it, and something like resolve. Mercer sat down on the stool by the workbench. Maeve picked up a blanket from the pile Mrs. Fisk had organized and brought it to him without making a production of it. She put it around his shoulders and then stood beside him, her arms folded, her eyes on the door. It was Bishop who came through it 20 minutes later. He came in through the back, the same way Mercer and Maeve had, which meant he knew to avoid the street, which meant he'd been thinking. He stood in the doorway of the forge and looked at the room, 20 people, the children in the corner, the weapons, the banked forge, and the layout on the workbench, and he took it all in. Then he looked at Mercer. Then he looked at Maeve. He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out an object and held it. It was a pocket watch, Mercer's pocket watch, which had fallen from his coat when he went down in the street, and which Bishop must have retrieved. It was a good watch, old silver, engraved on the back with a crest, the Murdoch family crest, though Bishop didn't know that yet. He was looking at it in his palm, the way a person looks at something they've picked up and kept without fully knowing why. "I found this in the street," he said. "After you went down?" Maeve crossed to him and took the watch. She looked at the engraving. She looked at Mercer. Mercer held out his right hand. She put the watch in it. He closed his fist around it. Bishop looked at Mercer on his stool with the sling and the blanket and the 30-odd years on his face, and whatever it was the pocket watch meant. "I've been standing in the street for an hour," Bishop said, "since they took you inside." He said it without defense or apology, just stated it. Watching Jesse Murdoch threaten an unarmed town and trying to find a reason. "Did you find one?" Maeve said. Bishop looked at her. He looked at the badge on his chest, which he'd been wearing for 14 months, and which had been, until now, largely decorative in any situation involving the Murdoch name. He put his hand to it. He didn't take it off. He just touched it, the way you touch something you're deciding about. "Jesse fired on an unarmed man," Bishop said, "in front of witnesses, in front of his own father." He paused. "That's a crime. That's a specific documentable crime, and it happened in my jurisdiction." Mercer waited. "I can't take on 20 men," Bishop said. "Let's be clear about that." "Nobody's asking you to take on 20 men," Maeve said. "We're asking you to enforce the law inside your own town." Bishop looked at her. Something crossed his face, the recognition of a man hearing his own responsibility, articulated clearly for the first time. He reached inside his coat. He came out with the double-barrel shotgun he'd carried on his hip since the day he was sworn in and had never once fired in the line of duty. He broke it open. He looked at the 2 shells inside. He snapped it shut. "Thaddeus and Jesse are separated," Maeve said to him. "Thaddeus has his men at the south end. Jesse is in the middle of the street." "I saw," Bishop said. "Thaddeus is thinking," she said. Something happened when he recognized Mercer. Something shifted in him. She looked at Mercer. "If we can get Thaddeus to hear the truth about his son, about Daniel, before Jesse does something worse, the 20 men become a different equation." Bishop looked at Mercer. "Is that true? About his son?" "Yes," Mercer said. "What happened?" "I'll tell Thaddeus first," Mercer said. "He's owed that," Bishop absorbed this. He looked at the shotgun in his hands. He looked at the room. "Here's what I can do," he said. "I can walk back out there and stand between Jesse and the rest of this street and tell him that what he did to you constitutes criminal assault and that he's going to face a legal process for it. I can tell it to Thaddeus, too." He paused. "I don't know if it'll hold, but I can say it out loud where everyone can hear it." "That's enough," Mercer said. "For now, that's exactly enough." Bishop looked at him. "You sure?" "When the badge says it out loud in front of witnesses," Mercer said, "it becomes part of the record. Jesse knows it. Thaddeus knows it. The hired men know it. It changes the math." Bishop straightened up. The hat went on, the straight, careful gesture of a man putting on the thing that means something about who he's trying to be. "I'll need you mobile," he said to Mercer. "Not now, but soon. Give me an hour." Mercer said. Maeve looked at Mercer. Then she looked at Bishop. He needs 40 minutes first. Food and water and horizontal. She said it with the authority of someone who had already decided this. Bishop looked at Mercer. Mercer nodded once. 40 minutes, Bishop said. He went back out the door. The forge was quiet for a moment. Then Mrs. Fisk said, from across the room, "Someone get the man some soup." There was movement, one of the women from the corner, already reaching for the pot Lou had sent over from the kitchen stores. Practical, efficient. The way people move in a crisis when they've found their footing. Maeve took the blanket from Mercer's shoulders, folded it, and indicated the floor by the forge, the warmest position in the room, where the iron wall radiated the stored heat of the banked coals. "Down," she said. He looked at her. "Gideon," she said. 40 minutes. He got down, carefully, and she folded the blanket under his head for the left shoulder, and she sat with her back against the warm iron wall beside him and accepted the soup bowl when it came and held it out to him. He ate. The room moved quietly around them. People checking positions, speaking low, doing the small preparatory things that help a person feel ready. Toby was not there, and Maeve was glad. She wanted him safe in Mrs. Fisk's back room for exactly as long as possible. She thought about what came next. She thought about a man lying in frozen mud with her name in his throat. She thought about a badge that had been a piece of tin for 14 months and was, possibly, becoming something else. She thought about 20 armed men and a patriarch standing at the south end of the street thinking. The soup was gone. Mercer's eyes were closed. Not sleeping, his breathing was wrong for sleep. Too measured. Too deliberate. Doing the 4-count thing he did when he was managing pain. She sat beside him against the warm iron wall and watched the room and let him have the 40 minutes. Outside, Main Street waited in the flat winter light. Bishop was out there somewhere, standing between what was and what the law was supposed to be, holding a double-barrel shotgun and 30 seconds of courage that were going to have to stretch much further than 30 seconds. Inside the forge, 20 people breathed and held on. 38 minutes later, Mercer opened his eyes. "All right," he said. Maeve stood up and held out her hand. He took it and came to his feet in one careful motion, and she steadied him until the room leveled, and then they stood together in the warm light of the banked forge while the room watched and waited. "Time to go," she said. "Time to go," he agreed. She picked up his coat. She helped him into it. She did not let go of his arm until he nodded, and then she let go, and they walked to the door together. The afternoon light was going when they came out of the forge. Not dark yet, but moving that direction, the sky had shifted from flat white to the dull pewter that comes in the hour before sunset in January, and the shadows from the buildings stretched long and blue across the frozen street. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees since noon. Mercer felt it in the shoulder immediately, the cold tightening everything around the wound the way cold does, and he breathed through it and kept walking. Maeve stayed close on his right side, not holding him. Present. Bishop was where he'd said he'd be in the center of Main Street, equidistant, between the forge end and the south end, where Thaddeus's men were bunched. He had the double barrel in his hands, and he was standing with his feet apart and his hat straight, and from a distance he looked considerably steadier than he probably felt. Jesse was 20 yards south of Bishop, on foot now, his horse handed off to one of the 3 men still with him. He had his coat open despite the cold. The pistol was holstered, but his hand was near it, and he was watching Bishop with the expression of a man who has been told no and hasn't decided what to do about it yet. Thaddeus was further back, at the edge of his assembled riders. He was watching the street. When Mercer and Maeve came out of the forge alley and onto the boards, Thaddeus's attention moved to them and stayed there. Mercer walked south. He kept his pace even. The wound was a sustained, deep pressure rather than a sharp pain now, which was either improvement or the body making a pragmatic adjustment to a new set of circumstances. His left arm was in the sling. His right hand was loose at his side. He passed Bishop. Bishop fell in beside him without being asked. Jesse watched them come. He looked at the sling. He looked at Mercer's face. He looked at Bishop's shotgun. Something moved through his expression. Not retreat. Jesse Murdoch didn't retreat, but a rapid recalculation. The kind that happens when the shape of a situation turns out to be different than what was assumed. "You've got no standing here, Bishop," Jesse said. "Criminal assault in my jurisdiction," Bishop said. "That's all the standing I need." He provoked. "He was unarmed and you shot him from behind," Bishop said. "I watched it happen. Every man in this street watched it happen." He kept walking. One step. Two. "That's a crime, Jesse. It'll be treated as one." Jesse's jaw tightened. He looked past them, toward Thaddeus. Thaddeus did not move. He did not signal his men. He stood at the south end of the street and watched his son look to him for rescue, and he did not provide it. Jesse's hand moved toward his holster. Bishop raised the shotgun. The movement in the street stopped. Every hired man, every watching face, every held breath in the vicinity of Main Street, Oak Haven, all of it went absolutely still in that half-second way that extreme tension produces, the entire world seeming to pause to see what the next second would contain. Mercer kept walking. He walked past Jesse, who was looking at the shotgun and the calculus of what it meant, and he walked toward Thaddeus. He stopped 6 feet from the patriarch. The hired men were all around him, 20 of them, most of them with hands near iron. He was aware of all of them in the peripheral way of a trained scout present in his awareness without taking the center of it. The center of it was Thaddeus Murdoch, who was looking at him with those pale eyes and waiting. "You wanted to know what happened to Daniel," Mercer said. Thaddeus was quiet. Behind Mercer, the frozen standoff between Bishop and Jesse held without resolution. "Yes," Thaddeus said. Mercer reached into his right coat pocket. He did it slowly and deliberately, making the movement visible to every hired man watching, and he brought out the pocket watch. He held it in his palm. The silver caught what remained of the afternoon light. The Murdoch crest on the back faced up, the engraved lines of it clean and precise, untarnished because Mercer had kept it clean for 13 years. He didn't know exactly why. Perhaps because it was the only physical thing he had left of a debt he'd been carrying for as long. Thaddeus looked at the watch. Something happened in his face. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet, specific movement of a man who recognizes an object he last saw in his son's hands. And that recognition travels straight through every defense the years have built and arrives somewhere unprotected. "I gave that to him before he shipped out," Thaddeus said. His voice was even. He was working to keep it that way. "I know," Mercer said. "He told me." He kept the watch in his palm, extended between them. He showed it to the men in his unit. He was proud of it. Thaddeus looked at the watch, then at Mercer's face. Mercer began. "The retreat was in October," he said. "The 14th had been hit hard 2 days prior. We were moving north through the valley to regroup. Daniel was commanding the rear guard, 8 men, covering the rest of the unit's withdrawal." He paused. "The Confederate skirmishers came up faster than we'd anticipated. They outflanked the rear guard on the east side." Thaddeus said nothing. He was listening with his whole body, that particular stillness that a person achieves when they are receiving something they have needed for a long time and are afraid that any movement will stop it. "One of my scouts, young man, 18. Name of Priest, got separated from the main unit," Mercer said. "He came out of the tree line into the open ground, right in the middle of it, in front of the skirmishers." He looked at Thaddeus directly. Daniel saw it. He redirected 2 men from his flanking position to pull Priest back, and then he went himself. Thaddeus breathed. "He reached Priest," Mercer said. "He got the boy moving, and in the open ground, one of the Confederate sharpshooters he stopped. He looked at the watch in his palm. Daniel took the shot that was meant for Priest. Silence. In the street behind them, nothing moved. "He died in the field," Mercer said, "within the hour. I was with him." He closed his hand around the watch. "He asked me to see that you got this. I should have found you sooner. I've been carrying it too long. and that's a failure I own. Thaddeus stood in the gathering cold and breathed. The breath that came out of him was unsteady, and he brought one large hand up to his face briefly and pressed his fingers against his eyes, and then lowered it and was composed again, or close enough to compose that the distinction mattered only to someone watching carefully. He died covering his men, Thaddeus said. He died covering one man, Mercer said, a boy who had nobody between him and the skirmishers. Your son put himself in that space. He held out the watch. He was 22 years old, and he moved without hesitation. That's not something that's in a man by accident. That's something that was put in him before he ever shipped out. Thaddeus looked at the extended watch. He reached out and took it. He turned it over in his hands, the way a man handles an object he thought was gone from the world. He looked at the crest. He turned it back and opened the cover and looked at the face. The minute hand was still moving. Mercer had wound it, periodically, for 13 years. He didn't know what to say about that exactly, except that it had seemed important to keep it going. Thaddeus noticed this. He looked up at Mercer. You kept it wound, he said. Yes. A pause. Why? Mercer thought about how to answer that. Because it was his, he said. And because I intended to deliver it, and a stopped clock is a finished thing. Thaddeus closed the cover of the watch. They told me you deserted, he said. That you abandoned the rear guard, and Daniel died, because there was nobody competent to lead the retreat. I know what they told you, Mercer said. I was cashiered on that charge. There was a military inquiry. He looked at Thaddeus steadily. I was cleared. The inquiry took 8 months, and by then the war was over, and nobody particularly wanted to revisit it. The men who filed the initial report had reasons of their own for wanting the blame to land somewhere, other than the poor tactical decisions that split the unit in the first place. Thaddeus absorbed this. He was running through it. Mercer could see it. The methodical re-examination of something he'd held as settled for over a decade, turning each piece over and looking at the other side. Daniel's letters, Thaddeus said slowly. He wrote about his commanding officer, he said. He stopped. He looked at the watch in his hands. He said the man had more patience and more sense than any officer he'd served under, that his men would follow him anywhere. He looked up. I didn't connect the name. It was a long time ago. It was, Mercer said. The street had gone very quiet behind them. Not the tense quiet of a moment before violence, a different quality, more reflective. The quiet of people listening to something that matters. Thaddeus turned and looked at Jesse. Jesse was still 20 yards north, Bishop's shotgun still raised. The 3 hired men behind Jesse all standing with a carefulness that suggested nobody wanted to be the person who escalated something that appeared to be changing. Thaddeus looked at his son for a long time. Jesse met his father's gaze. Something passed between them that was complicated by distance and history, and the particular architecture of a father and son who had spent decades in a relationship where one of them held all the structural weight. Then Jesse's jaw came up. He was talking, Jesse said, loud enough to carry. Whatever he's telling you, he's a man you don't know, and I've had 2 days of what he does. You've been here an hour. Thaddeus looked at Jesse for another moment. Then he looked back at Mercer. My eldest son, Thaddeus said quietly enough that only Mercer could hear, spent 2 years in the war and came home in a box. I spent the time since then building a wall around this valley and calling it legacy. He paused. I told myself it was for the family, for Daniel's memory. He turned the watch over once. Daniel would have hated every acre of it. Mercer said nothing. This was not the moment for words. He used to argue with me, Thaddeus said, from the time he was young, about the lease arrangements, about how we treated the people on the land. A pause. I told him he didn't understand business. He looked at the watch. He understood something better than business. The light was fading faster now. Another 20 minutes, and it would be dark. Mercer lowered his voice. A father's legacy, he said, isn't measured in the acres he steals. It's measured in whether he taught his sons to value human life or trample it. Thaddeus looked at him sharply, not offended hearing. The look of a man who has just been handed a sentence that explains something he's been unable to articulate. He looked at Jesse again. Jesse, who had shot a man in the back in broad daylight. Jesse, who had put a woman on her knees in a saloon. Jesse, who was standing in the middle of a frozen street with his hand near his gun, threatening to burn a town, performing power for hired men because it was the only language he'd been taught. Thaddeus Murdoch was not a stupid man. He had never been a stupid man. He had been a grieving man and a proud one, and one who had built an empire as a response to loss and confused the empire for meaning. But he was not stupid. What moved through his face in that moment was not surprise. It was recognition, which is worse the specific pain of seeing something clearly that you have been, with great effort, not you. He's going to force it, Thaddeus said, meaning Jesse. Whatever I say now, he's going to push until something breaks. I know, Mercer said. Can your people hold? The question was direct. Mercer appreciated that. Yes, he said. Thaddeus looked at the hired men around him. 20 men paid for their presence and their guns and their willingness to do what the Murdoch name required. He looked at each of them in turn slowly, the way a man looks at things he is reassessing. If I pull my men back, Thaddeus said quietly, Jesse still has 3. 3 we can manage, Mercer said. He'll burn something if he can, Thaddeus said. He's past thinking. I know that too. And the law? Thaddeus looked past Mercer toward Bishop, who was still holding his position with the shotgun, his badge catching the last of the afternoon light. The sheriff, is he real today? More real than he was yesterday, Mercer said, getting more real by the hour. Thaddeus was quiet for a moment. Daniel picked good men, he said. Then he turned. He addressed his hired riders in the flat, direct voice of a man who does not repeat himself. We're pulling back. South end of the street. Leave your positions. A pause. Movement. The riders, who had been in their arranged positions for hours, began slowly repositioning south. Jesse's voice came up immediately from the middle of the street. What? What are you doing? We haven't. These people haven't? Jesse, Thaddeus said. His voice carried without effort. Come here. I'm not... Jesse. Repeated at the same volume, same register. Not louder. Not angrier. Just the second time, which in the context of Thaddeus Murdoch's relationship with his sons, meant something structural. Jesse stared at his father. The 3 men with him looked at each other. Jesse walked south. He came to within a few yards of his father and stopped. Up close, in the diminishing light, his face showed the particular quality of a man who has been running hot, for too long, the skin drawn, and the eyes too bright, and the jaw held at an angle that was working hard. He was telling you lies, Jesse said. Whatever he said about Daniel, He gave me your brother's watch, Thaddeus said. Jesse stopped. He looked at the watch in his father's hand. He knew the watch. Every Murdoch knew the watch. It had been a constant presence in their father's hand for most of their childhood. Before Thaddeus gave it to Daniel the day he left, something moved through Jesse's face that was difficult to categorize. Not grief, exactly, or not only grief. Grief complicated by the long shadow of an older brother who had been better than him at most things and who had been mourned for a decade in a way that Jesse had never known how to exist alongside. He could have found that watch anywhere, Jesse said, but his voice had lost its assurance. He told me how Daniel died, Thaddeus said, the truth of it. He looked at Jesse with those pale eyes that his sons had both inherited and used differently, not the version we were given, the true one. Jesse looked away from his father. He looked at Mercer, who was standing several yards away. He looked at Bishop and the shotgun. He looked at Maeve, who had taken up a position near the forge entrance and was watching the street with her arms at her sides. So what? Jesse said. So he tells you a story, and you fold. You come all this way with 20 men, and you fold. I came all this way, Thaddeus said, because you put your hands on a woman and a man stopped you, and your pride couldn't accommodate the stopping. He paused. I'm looking at you right now, and I'm seeing what that pride has made you into. Jesse's head came up. He broke Cole and Decker's. They were reaching for iron, Thaddeus said, over a bar tab. He looked at his son. That's what you brought me here for. A bar tab and a wounded ego and 3 men you'd already outrun the decency of. His voice didn't rise. Your brother died covering a boy who had no one else. And he stopped. He looked at the watch in his hand. He put it in his coat pocket. You are a long way from your brother. The color left Jesse's face. What happened next was fast. Jesse's hand moved not toward Thaddeus, toward his holster, and it wasn't a considered choice. It was the reaction of a man who has been told the worst true thing about himself and has only one language for the feeling that produces. Mercer was already moving. Wounded shoulder, compromised arm, 48 hours of accumulated damage, none of that mattered in the half-second of real action, because the body that has been trained extensively doesn't consult the inventory of its limitations before it responds. He covered the ground between himself and Jesse in 3 steps and got his right hand on Jesse's gun arm, just above the wrist. Jesse was strong. He was younger and uninjured and fueled by something that was beyond strategy now, pure reactive violence, and for 2 seconds, it was a genuine contest. But Mercer had leverage and angle, and the particular advantage of a man who has spent decades understanding exactly how a body moves when it is trying to draw iron, and he knew which way to push, and he pushed it. Jesse's gun hand went wide. The pistol discharged. The shot went into the frozen ground 6 feet to the left of anyone. And then Bishop was there. Shotgun reversed, the stock connecting with Jesse's forearm with a crack that ended the contest immediately. Jesse's gun hit the ground. He went to his knees. Mercer stepped back. His left shoulder was screaming. He pressed his right hand against it through the coat and breathed in the 4-count pattern and stayed upright by a combination of will and the specific stubbornness that had been carrying him through harder circumstances than this for most of his adult life. Bishop had Jesse on the ground, the man's arms being pulled behind him, the sheriff's knee in the small of his back. The 3 hired men who had been with Jesse took one look at the situation, Thaddeus's pulled-back riders, their employer face down in the mud, a shotgun and a warrant in play, and their hands went up and away from their holsters simultaneously. Garrett came out of the livery alley, at a run with 2 men behind him. Dawes came down from the roof of the general store. Fisk's husband came out of the forge. The street was suddenly full of people who had been waiting in specific places for exactly this. Jesse, face down in the mud with Bishop's knee on his back, was saying something. His voice was muffled, and the words were losing coherence, moving away from language towards something rawer, the sound of a man who has been running at full speed and has suddenly, completely lost the ground under him. Thaddeus stood at the edge of it and watched. His face was very still. Mercer walked to him. They stood side by side, the 2 of them, and watched Bishop haul Jesse Murdoch to his feet and walk him north toward the jail end of Main Street. Jesse didn't go quietly, but he went, which was, Mercer knew, the only thing that mattered about the going. He'll need a trial, Thaddeus said. Yes, Mercer said. I won't interfere with it, I know. Thaddeus turned his head and looked at Mercer. How do you know that? Because you're not Jesse, Mercer said. Thaddeus looked at his son's retreating back, at the badge on Bishop's chest, catching the last silver light of the afternoon, at the people coming out of the forge, Mrs. Fisk with children around her, Maeve walking toward the center of the street, Lou coming out of the black kettle with his coat half on. What did you do, Thaddeus said, after you were cleared? After the inquiry. Found a forge, Mercer said. Tried to make something useful. Is that enough after everything? Mercer looked at the street, at Maeve, who had stopped in the middle of it, and was looking back at him. At the forge, where the hammer had been the first sound he'd heard in this town, and would, he intended, be among the last sounds at the end of each day for some time to come. Some days, he said, on the good ones. Yes. Thaddeus put his hand in his coat pocket and held the watch there without taking it out. Thank you, he said, for telling me. I should have come years ago, Mercer said. You're here now, Thaddeus said. He turned. He walked back to his riders. He spoke to them in the brief, definitive way of a man issuing orders for the last time in a particular place. And the column began to reform, turning their horses south. Mercer stood and watched them go. Maeve came to stand beside him. They stood in the middle of Main Street as the Murdoch riders moved south and the town came out around them. People emerging from the forge and the saloon and the spaces between buildings, coming back into the street they'd been pushed out of for 2 days, testing it with their presence, finding it still there. Garrett was already moving his freight wagons back, the barricade that hadn't needed to be used. Mrs. Fisk was talking to someone at the forge door. Dawes was down from the roof and crossing the street toward the saloon, which suggested priorities Mercer respected. "It's over?" Maeve said. "Jesse's part is," he said. "The rest needs daylight and a legal process and time. But the immediate part." "Yes." She exhaled. It was a long, slow exhalation, the kind that comes when something has been held for days and the holding is finally over. She didn't collapse. She didn't cry. She just breathed it out, and her shoulders came down a fraction from where they'd been. "Your shoulder," she said. "I know. Hennessy's going to have opinions. I know that too." She turned toward him. He turned toward her. They were close in the middle of the street, the town moving around them in the slow, relieved motion of people coming back to themselves. She reached up and put her hand briefly against the side of his face. Just her palm, warm against his cold skin. A second. 2. Then she took her hand back. "Come inside," she said. "Let me look at the shoulder." "Yes," he said. They walked back toward the black kettle, side by side, and the forge was behind them, with its warmth and its iron smell. And ahead of them the saloon windows were lit yellow against the gathering dark, and the first stars were coming out over Wyoming in the east. Behind them, at the south end of Main Street, the last of the Murdoch riders disappeared around the bend. The street was theirs again. Jesse Murdoch did not go quietly to jail. That was expected. Bishop had him cuffed with Mercer's iron, the ones forged in the shop across the street, which felt like the right kind of justice. And Jesse spent the first hour in the cell, throwing himself against the bars and shouting threats through the small window that faced Main Street. His voice carried. The whole town could hear him. Nobody came to let him out. By midnight, though, something changed. The 3 hired men who'd stayed with Jesse, the ones who'd surrendered their guns in the street, had ridden south before dark, back to the Murdochs, spread with whatever story they'd decided to tell. But 3 others hadn't gone with Thaddeus. 3 diehards, men who'd been on Jesse's payroll directly, rather than his father's, came back at midnight with torches. Mercer heard them before he saw them. He was in the saloon's back room, shoulder freshly rebandaged by a disapproving Hennessy, when the smell of smoke reached him. He was on his feet before the first shout outside. Maeve was already at the window. "East End," she said. "They're trying to light the feed store." The feed store shared a wall with the building next to the livery. If it caught, the fire would travel fast. Mercer knew this. He'd known it for days, which was why Mrs. Fisk's people had wet those walls that morning, and the morning before. "Get Garrett," he said. She was already gone. What happened in the next 20 minutes was not elegant. It was loud and cold and chaotic. The way real things are not a plan executing cleanly, but people moving fast in the dark with purpose, which is different, and sometimes better. Garrett came out of the livery with 2 buckets before the second torch found the wall. Fisk's husband had the forge water ready, the scalding runoff from the day's cooling, held in the barrel by the back door for exactly this. He moved it in a cart. It wasn't graceful. It worked. The first man with a torch came around the east corner of the feed store and found Dawes's cousin on the roof of the building adjacent, rifle in hand, with the calm of a man who had been waiting in the cold for 3 hours and was done waiting. The shot took the man in the leg. He went down, screaming. The torch went out in the frozen mud. The second man ran. The third didn't run fast enough. He met Garrett coming the other way, and Garrett, who had been awake for 2 days and had freight wagons to move and horses to calm and a town to help defend, expressed his feelings about the situation by taking the man off his feet with a single efficient tackle that would have impressed a much younger man. Bishop came out of the jail with his shotgun and a lantern and found the situation largely resolved. He arrested the two who remained conscious and put them in the cell with Jesse, which made the cell crowded and unpleasant, which seemed appropriate. Jesse, when he heard what had happened, went quiet, not repentant, but quiet, the sound of a man beginning to understand for the first time that the walls around him were not coming down. At 1:30 in the morning, the street was still. Mercer stood outside the forge in the cold and let his shoulder ache and looked at the sky. Clear tonight. The stars were enormous over Wyoming in winter, the way they get when the air is cold enough to strip everything hazy away. Maeve came out and stood beside him. "The feed store's fine," she said. "Wet walls held. Good. Dawes's cousin is already telling the story in the saloon." "He'll be telling it for 20 years, Mercer said. She smiled. Not the almost smile. The real one. The one he'd seen maybe 4 times since the night with the iron tongs, and each time it had struck him as something worth waiting for. "Probably 30, she said. They stood in the cold and said nothing for a while. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that means something has been settled between two people, not just around them. "Jesse will face a real trial," Mercer said. "Bishop's already written to the circuit judge." "I know," she said. "I helped him write the letter." He looked at her. "He needed help with the formal language," she said simply. Inside the saloon, someone started playing the piano. Badly, enthusiastically, the way people play when they are relieved to still be alive and don't care about technique. A few voices joined in. Lou's laugh carried through the wall. Oakhaven was exhaling. Mercer looked at the forge. The coals inside were banked but glowing, the way they always were, never fully out, never burning wastefully, just holding their heat through the long cold hours until morning. He thought about what Thaddeus had said. "You're here now." He thought about the pocket watch, now in a dead man's father's coat pocket, where it belonged. 13 years he'd carried that weight. He hadn't known, fully, how heavy it was until it was gone. His shoulder ached. His right hand trembled in the cold. He looked at Maeve beside him, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her breath making small clouds in the winter air, her eyes on the stars. She had rallied people who were scared. She had organized supplies and positions and a battle plan and a letter to a judge. She had sat with him on the floor of the forge with her back against warm iron and held his shaking hand without making it smaller than it was. And she had called him by his given name in front of everyone and not taken it back. "Thank you," he said. She turned to look at him. "For what?" "For not running," he said, when any reasonable person would have. She was quiet for a moment, thinking about it seriously, the way she did everything. "You didn't run either," she said. "I had less reason to stay," he said. "And more to run from." She looked at him. The stars were bright behind her. The piano inside had found a key it liked and was staying there. "You have reasons to stay now," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said, "I do." Thaddeus Murdoch rode back into Oakhaven at 8 in the morning. He came alone, no riders, no hired guns. Just the man himself on his horse, straight-backed and unhurried as always. But something different in it today, the posture of a man carrying something heavy and moving forward anyway. He went to Bishop's office first. Mercer heard about this from Maeve, who heard it from Lou, who watched through the saloon window with his coffee and reported with the thoroughness of a man who understood that history was occurring and intended to account for it properly. Thaddeus was in Bishop's office for 40 minutes. When he came out, he crossed to the land office, the Murdoch land office, the one that had been running predatory lease arrangements through this valley for a decade, and he spent another hour inside with the clerk. He came to the forge at 10. Mercer was at the anvil, working through a set of repairs that had backed up during the last 4 days. His left arm was still in the sling. He developed a left-handed way of managing the tongs and a right-handed swing that accounted for the uneven balance. It worked. Not well. Well enough. Thaddeus knocked on the open door. Mercer set the hammer down and turned. The elder, Murdoch, looked older in the morning light than he had in the street yesterday. Or maybe he looked his age, which was something different. He came inside and stood in the warmth of the forge and looked at the tools on the walls, and his expression was quiet and tired in the way of a man who has not slept. He reached into his coat and put a folded set of papers on the workbench. "The lease agreements," he said. "The ones on the Valley properties. I've signed them over to the individual holders." He looked at the papers. Clear title. No outstanding obligations. Mercer looked at the papers. He didn't touch them. "That's 20 families," he said. 23, Thaddeus said. "I counted." "Why?" Thaddeus looked at the pocket watch, which he'd taken out at some point and was holding without being aware of it. The old habit of a man who had carried it for one day and already returned to the motion. "Because Daniel would have," he said. "Because it's 30 years overdue. Because Jesse is going to stand trial and face what he's done, and I will not obstruct that process." He paused. "And because a man I don't deserve respect from gave me my son back, and I don't know another way to answer that." Mercer was quiet. "I'm leaving Oakhaven," Thaddeus said. "The spread will be sold, not passed down. Whatever Jesse inherits from me, after the courts are done, he'll earn without my name behind it." He put the watch back in his pocket. "He might surprise me. He probably won't. But I'm done deciding for him." He held out his hand. Mercer shook it. The grip was firm and brief, the handshake of men who have said the real things already and don't need to perform the rest. Thaddeus turned and walked out of the forge and down Main Street to his horse, and he rode south, and he did not look back. By noon, the news was through town. Garrett read his deed 3 times before he believed it. Pell sat down in the middle of his store and just sat there for a while, which everyone who heard about it understood completely. The 23 families who had been working someone else's land on terms designed to keep them perpetually behind were, for the first time in years, working their own. Maeve brought Toby to the forge after lunch. The boy came in with his iron bar and his coat and took his usual stool and looked at Mercer, who was still at the workbench, though he'd long since stopped pretending to work. Toby studied the sling. He signed something. Mercer read it. "Getting better." He signed back. "Getting better then, slowly." Toby nodded, accepting this. He signed, "Can I file?" Mercer pointed at the bar and at the file hanging on the wall, and Toby was off the stool immediately. The sound of small, careful strokes on iron filled the shop, steady and methodical, the same rhythm it always was. Maeve sat on the stool by the door. She had a mug of coffee, and she wrapped both hands around it and looked at the forge. "Lou offered to buy the black kettle," she said. "Properly. Full ownership he's been saving for years. What did you tell him?" "I told him yes." She looked at the coffee. "I've been thinking about what I want to do after." Mercer waited. "Toby's teacher has been wanting help at the school. Another person who signs." She paused. "The children there, some of them, don't talk to him much. Not because they're cruel. They just don't know how." "Teach them," Mercer said. "I intended to." She looked up. "I also intend to stay in Oakhaven." "In case you were wondering, I was," he said. She almost smiled, and then she actually smiled, and that was worth all of it. Outside, the street was normal, in the way streets should be people walking. A horse outside the general store, children cutting across the far end toward the schoolhouse. The ordinary business of a town living its life without someone's boot on its neck. Mercer stood up from the workbench. He went to the peg by the door where his gun belt hung. He took it down. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. 13 years of carrying this particular weight, not just the leather and iron, but everything it signified, everything he'd had to be, and do, and carry forward. He hung it on the peg next to his blacksmith apron. Not thrown down, not buried, just set aside, available if it was needed. Not the first thing he reached for anymore. Toby looked up from his filing. He looked at the gun belt on the peg. He looked at Mercer. He signed, staying. Mercer looked at the forge, at the work on the bench, at Maeve with her coffee and her real smile, at the boy who had rearranged his fingers with complete authority and taught him please, and thank you, and good work, and I'm here. He signed back, staying. Toby grinned the full one, the unguarded one, and went back to his filing. The forge rang with honest work. Outside, dawn's light moved slow and gold over Oakhaven, over the valley, over 23 pieces of land that belong now to the people standing on them. The plains stretched wide and cold and open, in every direction, the way they always had, indifferent to the small human struggles that played out against them. But inside the forge it was warm, and the hammer fell, and the iron held, and the work continued. This is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and locations are products of the author's imagination, and do not represent any real persons or actual events.